Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up, dim the screen, let your eyes settle. We are going back to Springfield tonight. And we are going deeper than most people are willing to go. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17th, 1989, 36 seasons, 788 episodes. It is the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running sitcom, and the longest-running scripted primetime show in the entire history of television. And in all that time, across every single one of those episodes, nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. But tonight we are not starting with the aging problem. We are starting with something older and stranger, something that sits at the very foundation of everything in Springfield, like a cracked support beam holding up a building that nobody has had the nerve to inspect. We are starting with the power plant. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant, 2 units, pressurized water reactor facility, owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town, and by any reasonable measure, it is one of the most dangerous industrial facilities in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection conducted during the show's early seasons found 342 violations, 342 separate ways in which that facility was failing to meet basic safety standards. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. And here is the quiet detail that makes that refusal so chilling. He did not refuse because he could not afford it. Burns is a billionaire many times over. He refused because fixing the problems would mean acknowledging they existed. And acknowledging they existed would mean someone might begin asking questions about what those problems had already done to the people living downwind of those cooling towers for the past several decades. The violations themselves are not minor paperwork infractions. We are talking about radioactive waste being dumped directly into rivers and bodies of water that Springfield's residents use. Radioactive waste being left on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on an employee's desk. Cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum. Glowing rats moving through the walls and subfloors of the facility. And then there is one the show drops into an episode casually and never revisits at all. Human skeletons found in the basement of the plant. Not animal remains. Not debris. Human skeletons in the basement of an active nuclear facility, and the show shows you the bones and then simply moves on. Nobody investigates. Nobody files a report. Nobody in Springfield stops to ask who those people were, how they ended up there, or what it means that they are there at all. The safety inspector responsible for preventing all of this, the man whose literal job is to stand between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe, is Homer Simpson. Homer, as the show's own creator has noted, has an IQ of 55. He once had a crayon removed from his brain, a crayon that had been lodged in there since childhood and had been physically reducing his cognitive function for his entire life. He sleeps at his workstation. He has eaten donuts during meltdown warnings. He once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor to see what would happen. This is the person managing the safety of a facility that powers an entire American town. And he has been doing it, more or less unchanged, for over 3 decades. Now, here is where things begin to accumulate in a way that is difficult to look away from. The very first visible mutant in Springfield appears in Season 2. A fish, pulled from a river near the power plant. A fish with 3 eyes, which the show names Blinky, and which immediately becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence that Burns is poisoning the local environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it is safe. The town watches. Then Springfield does what Springfield always does. It shrugs and moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody asks the question that should be obvious to everyone. If the fish near the power plant have 3 eyes, what exactly is happening to the people who have been drinking water from the same source for 20 or 30 years? The answer has been woven through the show since at least Season 8. In an episode called The Springfield Files, Homer stumbles across something in the woods near the edge of town and becomes convinced he has seen an alien. The entire community panics. FBI agents are called in to investigate. The episode builds toward what seems like a genuine reveal, and when the truth finally comes out, the figure Homer saw in the woods was not an alien at all. It was Mr. Burns. Burns, the episode explains, undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive and so chemically aggressive that afterward, his body emits what the show describes as a healthy green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Miss a session, and he dies. And after each session, Burns wanders out of the treatment facility in a dazed and euphoric state, stumbling through the darkened woods surrounding Springfield, glowing faintly in the dark like something from another world, which is, of course, exactly how the townspeople describe him. Burns literally glows in the dark. His body has absorbed enough radiation therapy that it emits visible light, and the population of Springfield sees this glowing figure moving through the trees, and their first instinct is not to think about the nuclear power plant that sits on their skyline, the one they drive past every day, the one that employs their neighbors. Their first instinct is to conclude it must be an alien. That is how thoroughly the town has normalized the extraordinary danger sitting at its center. And then in the Simpsons movie, the environmental evidence becomes impossible to ignore even within the show's own internal logic. Springfield's contamination reaches a point so severe that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal institution operating within the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed beneath a massive glass dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the surrounding region. The United States government looks at Springfield and concludes that the only viable solution is containment, not a fine, not a cleanup order, not a court injunction against the power plant, a dome. The entire town is classified as an environmental hazard zone, and every resident inside it, every person who has been drinking that water and breathing that air, stays inside when the dome comes down. Now look at the residents themselves. Look at them with fresh eyes and try to see them the way you might see them if you had never watched the show before. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that defies human biology, bulging eyes, a massive overbite, 4 fingers on each hand instead of 5, an IQ so low it qualifies under any clinical standard as a significant cognitive disability. His body absorbs damage that would kill any normal human being many times over. He has been shot, electrocuted, fallen from great heights, been struck by cars, survived explosions, and walked away from every single one of those events. His healing rate is not just cartoonish, it is biologically impossible. His pain tolerance is not just exaggerated. It operates on a level that no human nervous system should be capable of sustaining. And he has spent his entire adult life working in close proximity to an active nuclear reactor core. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers, hair that defies the laws of physics and gravity, rising straight into the air in a tower that she has maintained in the exact same shape for 36 years with no visible product or structural support. Marge was also employed at the nuclear facility for a period, exposed to the same violations, the same leaking radiation, the same compromised infrastructure. All 3 of their children, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie, were born after both parents had already spent years absorbing Springfield's environmental contamination. Every single one of the children displays physical characteristics that do not occur in any normal human population. Spiky hair that maintains its shape without product, overbites, bulging eyes, yellow skin, and there is the detail that really makes this theory cohere into something uncomfortable. When celebrities visit Springfield in the show, when guest characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes are shaped with more realistic anatomy. Their features more closely resemble what actual human beings look like. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws Springfield residents. And the standard explanation everyone reaches for is that it is just the art style, just how the show looks. But within the internal logic of Springfield's own universe, there is a visible and observable difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who come from outside it. The people inside look mutated. The people from the outside look normal. Even the animals show it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging proportions as his owners. The same deviation from normal canine anatomy. Blinky the 3-eyed fish is the show telling you directly what the radiation is doing to living organisms in Springfield's ecosystem. And then the show expects you to accept that the exact same radiation has somehow had zero effect on the humans consuming the same environment. Burns knows this. The show makes it explicit across multiple episodes in ways that get treated as comedy and never taken seriously. Burns funds private medical research. He retains personal physicians. He undergoes weekly treatments that keep him alive through what amounts to chronic radiation exposure. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield, because radiation is the thing keeping him alive. and the treatments that sustain him are derived from the same nuclear technology his plant uses to generate power. He has the resources. He has the pharmaceutical infrastructure. He has personal medical teams capable of synthesizing experimental compounds. He knows precisely what radiation does to biological systems, because radiation is doing it to his body every single week. And he knows what his plant is doing to Springfield, because in many ways, Springfield is his laboratory. Homer's employment at the plant is not negligence on Burns's part. The show makes this clearer than it perhaps intends. In the episode where a group of German investors briefly purchases the plant, the first thing they do after acquiring it is fire Homer. The second thing they do is commission a full safety assessment, and the estimated cost of bringing the facility up to code nearly bankrupts them outright. Burns buys the plant back from them and immediately reinstates Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut that facility down within a week. Homer ensures the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated, and Burns maintains his grip on Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension the entire population of the town. A population that, after decades of chronic low-level radiation exposure, may be too cognitively compromised to fully grasp what is happening to them. The crayon in Homer's brain becomes a much more layered detail under this reading. In Season 12, Homer has the crayon removed, and his intelligence surges dramatically. He becomes articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding the world around him at a level he has never previously managed, and for the first time he sees Springfield clearly. He sees his job clearly. He sees the structure of his life clearly, and it makes him profoundly miserable. The clarity is unbearable. He chooses to have the crayon reinserted. He chooses the fog. But the question the show never pauses on is how the crayon got there in the first place. How does a child get a crayon lodged in his brain without anyone noticing? How does Homer move through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, getting annual checkups from the town's medical professionals, and not a single one of them finds a foreign object in his skull? Either every doctor in Springfield is catastrophically incompetent, or someone in the town's medical infrastructure knew it was there and made a decision not to remove it. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare system, and the show does suggest his economic reach touches every institution in town, then Homer's crayon is not an accident waiting to be discovered. It is a mechanism of control. The medical establishment in Springfield is not looking the other way accidentally. It may be looking the other way because looking away is the economically rational thing to do when the town's largest employer prefers his safety inspector to remain cognitively limited. The radiation theory, when you follow it to its conclusion, does not explain one mystery about the Simpsons in isolation. It provides a framework that connects all of them. The characters do not age because their biology has been altered at the cellular level by chronic nuclear exposure. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's memory and critical thinking functions are compromised by ongoing neurological damage. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that grant him extraordinary physical resilience while devastating his cognition. Burns remains alive through weekly treatments because his wealth gives him access to managed radiation therapy that the ordinary residents of Springfield will never be offered. And nobody in Springfield questions any of this, because the same environmental poison that altered their physical development also damaged the part of their brains responsible for critical evaluation. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town built for easy laughs. Under the weight of the show's own canonical evidence, Springfield is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic, and the nuclear plant dominating their skyline, providing their power, employing their neighbors, poisoning their water, and irradiating their children is not a background gag. It is the engine of everything. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery from a fatal injury, every forgotten catastrophe, and every reset that wipes the slate clean between episodes. Every unexplained mystery and every unanswered question. All of it traces back to the same cracked cooling towers, leaking the same invisible damage into the same water supply, feeding the same compromised minds that cannot quite figure out why their fish have 3 eyes and their children have never grown up. The plant is not just part of the show, it is the condition under which the show exists. And the people of Springfield will never fully understand that because the plant has already ensured they cannot. Rest now, we are just getting started. If you are watching this late at night, Drop your location and the time in the comments below. It is always something to see how far across the world these conversations travel. And if you want to come back for more nights in Springfield, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you do not miss the next one. Let the edges of the room go soft. There is no rush here. We have all the time in the world inside Springfield. What we just explored, the radiation theory, the contaminated water, the mutated biology, the power plant as the source of everything wrong with the town, it is a compelling framework. It explains a great deal about why Springfield looks and behaves the way it does. But there is another theory, one that has been circulating in the corners of Simpsons fandom for over 2 decades, and it does something remarkable. It does not contradict the radiation theory. It absorbs it. It takes everything we just discussed and reframes it as the interior landscape of one man's unconscious mind. This is Homer's coma theory. And it is the single most debated, most emotionally resonant, most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of the show. Let's go back to April 1st, 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4 aired that night. It was called So It's Come to This? A Simpsons clip show. The premise was designed to feel lightweight. Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer. In the final prank, Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker, shaking it until the internal pressure has built to a dangerous level. Homer opens the can. The explosion is violent enough to land him in the hospital. And while Homer is lying in his hospital bed recovering, he spots a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for the machine. The machine tips. It falls. It crushes Homer, and he enters a coma. A real, clinical coma. Not a dream sequence. Not a cutaway gag. Homer Simpson flatlines and enters an unconscious state that the episode treats, for once, with genuine weight. It lasts 7 weeks within the show. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart is at his bedside, tearfully confessing that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately reaches for his son's throat, which is played for laughs because that is Homer's default response to Bart. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The episode ends, and The Simpsons continues for 32 more years as if nothing happened. And Homer's response to learning that he is permanently brain damaged to an additional degree is to laugh. He says he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this amusing. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends, unless Homer never woke up. The coma theory, originally articulated and popularized in online communities in the early years of internet fandom, proposes something simple and devastating. Homer did not wake up from that coma in April 1993. Every single episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character moment, every celebrity cameo, every impossible event and outlandish adventure is a dream. A sustained, elaborate dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him. The evidence is genuinely unsettling when you begin to look at it carefully. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a different show. Not unrecognizable, but grounded in a way that the later seasons are not. The storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer trying to quit drinking. Marge navigating the weight of being the emotional anchor of a family that does not always notice her effort. Lisa developing a crush on a substitute teacher who actually sees her. Bart struggling with his grades and facing the genuine possibility of being held back a year. These are everyday family difficulties, told through satire, but rooted in the kinds of situations real households experience. Financial anxiety, marital tension, the loneliness of being the smartest person in a room full of people who have no interest in becoming smarter. The show's emotional core was built on recognizable domestic struggle. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster and keeps it in his office. Homer becomes the leader of a neighborhood vigilante squad. Homer joins a secret society with elaborate rituals. Homer discovers that his mother has been living as a radical fugitive for 27 years. Homer meets God, has a genuine conversation with the creator of the universe, and then goes back to work at the power plant the following Monday as if nothing remarkable happened. Homer does this twice across the show's run. The show goes from a family sitcom, grounded in economic anxiety and domestic realism, to something where the main character has traveled to dozens of countries, held hundreds of different jobs across wildly different professional fields, befriended a seemingly endless parade of celebrities, survived physical trauma that would kill a trained soldier, and done all of this without any of it leaving a permanent mark on his life or changing his circumstances in any lasting way. The escalation is so dramatic that even casual fans who drifted away from the show during the middle seasons noticed the tonal shift when they looked back. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons peaked and when it lost its way for more than 20 years. The coma theory has a precise answer. The Simpsons did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. And here is where the theory becomes something you cannot quite shake once you have heard it. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a conversation with God, not a dream sequence presented as clearly metaphorical, a genuine face-to-face conversation, treated within the episode as real. And during that conversation, God tells Homer that he will one day learn the meaning of life, but that his time is not yet here. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline aligns. God warned Homer that his time was nearly up, and 6 months later his conscious life ended. What reads in isolation as a quirky theological gag becomes, under the coma theory, something closer to a prophecy. God was telling Homer that his waking life was approaching its end, that everything which followed would be the interior experience of a man whose body was still technically alive, but whose mind had retreated somewhere private and unreachable. The aging problem is where the coma theory makes its strongest argument. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle or changed the way their faces look across more than 3 decades of episodes. Every other theory about the show tries to account for this in its own way. The radiation theory suggests that the characters' mutated biology has altered their cellular aging process. The standard animation industry explanation is that it is simply how long-running cartoon shows work. But the coma theory has the simplest and most emotionally devastating answer available. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who fell unconscious in April of 1993 and has not opened his eyes since. Of course, his children do not age. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine Bart and Lisa and Maggie growing up because he was not present to witness it. His mind has no reference material for what his children look like as teenagers or adults because he never saw them get there. His wife does not age because the last image of Marge he carries in his waking memory is the way she looked in the spring of 1993, standing beside his hospital bed. His friends and neighbors do not change because his memory of them is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was the day he lost access to it, because that is what the unconscious mind does under long-term sedation. It reconstructs from available memory. It loops. It cycles. It holds everything still. And every episode since April 1993 is Homer's mind running simulations of a life he is no longer living, built entirely from the material available to him before the world went dark. The celebrity appearances in later seasons also become coherent under this reading. Homer's mind, lying in a hospital room, is constantly receiving ambient input. Sounds from a television left on in the corner. Conversations between nurses and family members at his bedside. Music from a radio down the hall. Fragments of media and overheard references being absorbed through the fog of unconsciousness and processed by a brain that is still, somewhere deep inside, trying to build a world. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield in the later seasons could be understood as a voice. Homer's mind heard through that fog, translated into a dream character by a brain working desperately to maintain the simulation. The dream is not stable. It is getting stranger over time, more surreal, more disconnected from everyday plausibility. And that progression is exactly what you would expect from a brain that is slowly deteriorating. Early seasons, the internal logic holds fairly well. Later seasons, the internal logic becomes increasingly flexible, increasingly willing to bend the rules of cause and effect, to ignore consequences, to allow Homer to do things that would be impossible in any reality. The dream is losing coherence because the mind generating it is losing coherence. Each passing year, the stories grow a little more detached from anything resembling grounded human experience. The show did eventually acknowledge the theory, in its own particular sideways fashion. In season 34, A fake deleted scene was deliberately leaked in which Homer wakes from a long coma, and it is revealed that all the outlandish episodes of the series were simply a dream. The scene was fully animated, fully voiced, presented as a genuine revelation, and then the show immediately revealed it was not real at all. It was described as a hoax scene inserted by outside parties, a bit of misdirection designed to mislead fans who were chasing the theory. But the fact that the scene was made at all tells you something important. The writers know about the coma theory. They engaged with it seriously enough to produce an entire animated sequence addressing it directly. They acknowledged that the theory holds together internally, and their denial came wrapped inside an episode that explicitly depicted Homer waking from a coma, which is a strange and particular way to say that something is not true. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory publicly in 2015. He said it was simply not accurate, that it was fan speculation and nothing more. But he did not address the tonal shift between the early and later seasons. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not account for the aging freeze in any way that does not also apply equally to the coma theory. He simply said it is not true and moved on. The fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official statement has managed to do. It makes the entire show make sense, from beginning to present, as a unified experience rather than a collection of increasingly disconnected episodes held together only by shared character names. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the increasingly surreal plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, Homer's ability to survive anything and recover completely by the following week. All of it becomes coherent if you accept that Homer is dreaming. The reset works because dreams reset. Homer survives because in the dream, his mind is the one constructing the narrative, and the mind will not kill the dreamer. The celebrities keep appearing because Homer's brain keeps absorbing new voices from the external world and adding them to the simulation. The world keeps getting stranger because the mind generating it is slowly losing resolution. And then there is the emotional dimension of the theory, which is the part that stays with you longest after you first encounter it. If the coma theory is true, the entire show is a tragedy. Not a comedy wearing a tragedy's clothes. An actual tragedy presented so gently and so lovingly that it reads as warmth. Homer's deepest wish is the simplest one imaginable. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his small, difficult, wonderful, mischievous boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her bedroom, still fighting for things that matter, still believing the world can be better than it is. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in one arm. He wants Sunday evenings at the house on Evergreen Terrace to go on forever. In the coma, the dream gives him all of that. Everything he wanted, preserved and held in place, his family sealed in amber at the moment he lost them. His children never growing up, his wife never changing, his life never ending. The dream is not a nightmare. Under the coma theory, it is the only version of heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. A house on Evergreen Terrace. Kids still young and loud and alive in the rooms above him. Beer cold in the refrigerator. Nothing to do but sit on the couch, be with his family, and let the evening go on forever. Every time Homer survives something impossible in the show, every time the world resets, every time the credits roll and everything is restored to how it was before, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's mind refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream finally collapses, then Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed without him, how old his children really are, whether Marge is still sitting by the bed, whether anyone is. The show will never confirm this, but it has never truly disproven it either, because the evidence is not buried in subtext. It is in the structure of the show itself. Nobody ages. Reality keeps loosening. Homer always finds his way home by the end of every episode, because in the dream, he never left. His mind is not going to let him leave. Not now, not ever. Sleep softly. The dream is still running. Let the quiet settle around you. This next one has been argued over for 30 years, and tonight we are going to sit with every piece of it patiently, without rushing to the answer the show wants us to accept. We know what the show told us. Season 7, Episode 1. Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 2. The answer is Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson, 1-year-old, found Burns' gun, and the gun went off. Case closed. Move on. Except the case was never really closed. And the more carefully you examine the evidence, the more you begin to feel that the official answer is less a solution and more a convenient resolution that allowed the show to move forward without addressing the genuine messiness underneath. Let's go back to the summer of 1995. Who Shot Mr. Burns was the summer of The Simpsons, in a way that the show has never quite replicated before or since. The show pulled off something that no animated series had ever attempted before. A genuine whodunit cliffhanger, a real mystery, designed with the explicit promise that the clues embedded in Part 1 were sufficient for a viewer to identify the shooter. Fox promoted it as a cultural event. The show invited viewers across America to submit their guesses, with the prize being an appearance as an animated character in a future episode. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as though it were a real unsolved case. The Simpsons was not just a television show that summer. It was a puzzle that the whole country was invited to solve. And the puzzle was designed around a genuine inciting incident. Burns had gone too far, even by his standards. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary School, gutting the school's funding. He had used financial pressure to destroy Moe's Tavern, forcing its owner into bankruptcy. He had built the infrastructure to block out the sun over the entire town, a literal mechanical disc designed to intercept sunlight so that every Springfield resident would be forced to buy their electricity from his power plant rather than from any natural source. He had fired Smithers, his loyal assistant of decades, when Smithers raised an objection to the scheme. By the end of Part 1, every single person in Springfield had a documented reason to want Burns dead. The episode took careful time establishing individual motives for dozens of named characters. Homer, because Burns had employed him for years and still could not remember his name. Bart and Lisa, because the school lost its oil well revenue. Grandpa Simpson, because the retirement home where he lived had been destroyed by Burns's machinations. Groundskeeper Willie, because he had lost his job. Tito Puente, whose music program was cut when the school's funding collapsed. Moe, whose tavern had been financially ruined. Even Smithers, freshly fired and in clear emotional distress. The whole town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Tensions in that room were such that multiple characters were shown holding or reaching for weapons. Then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two specific letters as he went down. The letter W and the letter S. Or, depending on your vantage point, M and S. The ambulance arrived. The screen went dark. America had all summer to think about it. Here is what the show delivered when Part 2 aired in September of 1995. The investigation plays like a comedic procedural, with Chief Wiggum at the center. Smithers confesses almost immediately, but his confession falls apart when it becomes clear he was blackout drunk during the relevant time period and had in fact shot someone else entirely. He shot old Jasper in the leg, the wooden one, nowhere near the scene of the actual crime. Suspects are eliminated one by one. Principal Skinner has an alibi. Moe has an alibi. Tito Puente delivers what might be the greatest alibi in the history of television. A full musical number explaining that he channeled his rage into a samba and performed it publicly all evening. The investigation stalls until a key piece of physical evidence is discovered. An eyelash found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis is run. The eyelash belongs to a Simpson. Homer has a documented motive, and his fingerprints are on the gun. He is arrested and is close to being convicted when Burns wakes from his coma and identifies the real shooter. It was Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson. According to Burns, he encountered the baby in the parking lot after the town meeting, attempted to take her lollipop, and in the struggle his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. The mystery was officially solved. Now let us take the official answer apart carefully. The Fox contest first. Thousands upon thousands of entries were submitted across the summer. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of entries guessed correctly. Not one. The individual who ultimately received the prize was chosen at random and had not identified the right answer, so they received a cash payment in lieu of the animated episode appearance. The writers have acknowledged on the commentary track that they were aware of one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night of the original broadcast. But this person was using a college internet account that had become inactive by the time the contest concluded. The one person in America who got it right was someone the producers could not find. That failure rate among viewers is worth sitting with. The show's creators designed the mystery, promoted it as solvable from internal clues, built a national contest around it, and when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had figured it out through the evidence provided. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient, the red herrings were simply too effective, or the answer did not follow from the available evidence in the clean logical chain the show implied it would. Look at the sundial. Burns falls and his hands point to W and S, or from his perspective, M and S. The show tells us these initials stand for Maggie Simpson, but Burns himself, canonically, on screen, explicitly stated that this was not intentional. He did not deliberately position himself to communicate his attacker's initials. He simply fell where he fell. The sundial clue, the central physical evidence the show uses to justify its answer, was described by the victim himself as a coincidence. The most prominent clue in one of the most famous mysteries in television history is, according to the person it supposedly came from, meaningless. Then there is the gun. Burns carried his gun in a holster. Shortly before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. Burns did not have yet his gun on him at the time of the attack. The shooter used Burns' own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who did not arrive at the town meeting intending to commit violence, who found the gun by chance, and used it impulsively rather than as part of any plan. Most of the primary suspects at the meeting had brought their own weapons because they were angry enough to potentially use them. The person who shot Burns was someone who showed up unarmed and found an opportunity. A baby finding a gun in a parking lot fits that profile. So do a substantial number of other characters who were not carrying their own weapons that evening. Burns' last words before being shot were reported as, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He was not surprised. He was not frightened. The phrasing is the language of recognition, not alarm. The way you might greet someone you have seen before, someone you do not consider a threat. Does Burns have a prior relationship with Maggie Simpson? Has there been any established meaningful interaction between them before this moment in the show's canon? The answer is essentially no. Burns barely recognizes Homer, despite Homer having worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with the relaxed recognition of seeing a familiar face does not fit what we know about him. Now, here is where the case becomes genuinely interesting, rather than simply technically uncertain. In Season 18, Homer openly claims that he was the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, in a regular episode. Nobody investigates. Nobody treats it as a confession requiring follow-up. Nobody reopens the case. Homer Simpson directly states that he committed the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as a throwaway line with no consequences. Two interpretations are available. Homer is lying, which is entirely consistent with his character and his love of being the center of attention. Or Homer is telling the truth and the original verdict was wrong, with Homer knowing it because he was the one who pulled the trigger. If the second interpretation is correct, then Maggie was not the shooter. Maggie was framed, whether deliberately or through the combined weight of circumstantial evidence being interpreted in the least threatening direction available. A baby cannot be prosecuted. Chief Wiggum says as much in the episode itself. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect resolution to an investigation that was heading toward a verdict with far more complicated implications. An infant cannot contest the accusation. An infant cannot be punished. An infant cannot hold a press conference. If someone in Springfield's power structure wanted to close the case cleanly and protect the real shooter, blaming Maggie was by far the simplest path. The Marge theory, proposed and developed in various corners of the fan community, carries surprising coherence. Marge had watched Burns systematically dismantle the institution her children attended, cause injury to her family's dog, steal the son from her community. She had motives rooted not in personal grievance but in maternal protectiveness, which in many ways runs deeper and cooler and more resolved than rage. And Burns famously fell in love with Marge during the episode. Marge gets a job, developing a romantic fixation that the show treated as uncomfortable comedy. If Burns retained any of that emotional attachment, it could explain why he woke from his coma and declined to identify Marge as his attacker. He took the bullet, recognized the person responsible, and chose to protect her. He let his eyes land on the sundial, let the letters mean whatever the investigators wanted them to mean, and redirected the case away from the one person he was not willing to see convicted. The alternate endings make the official story even harder to accept as definitive. A complete alternate conclusion was animated, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Not a rough sketch or a script draft, a fully voiced, fully produced, alternate ending. This version was shown in a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by pointing out that all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored and says that would be downright nutty. And then the clip show immediately references the O.J. Simpson trial as a real-world example of a case where DNA evidence was, in fact, set aside by a jury. The show is winking at you. It is telling you that ignoring DNA evidence is not a hypothetical impossibility. It has happened. It happens. Evidence points wherever the people managing the evidence want it to point. And the official answer is not necessarily the right answer simply because it was declared official. An early script draft had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this option seriously enough to develop it, with plans to send him to prison as a way of giving his character a new direction. It was ultimately abandoned. But the revision history of the mystery makes one thing clear. The answer was not predetermined by the clues embedded in Part 1. The clues were adjusted after the fact to fit whatever answer the writers eventually settled on. The mystery was reverse engineered. The evidence was arranged to support a predetermined destination rather than the destination being reached through following the evidence, which raises the final and most fundamental question the show never addresses directly. In a town where every single person had a documented motive, where dozens of residents were visibly carrying weapons at a public meeting about a man who had just stolen the sun, where the population is demonstrably prone to forming mobs over issues far less significant than losing access to daylight, how is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield is not a town known for restraint. These are people who riot at the drop of a hat. They have burned down their own institutions over misunderstandings. They organized a mob around a bear. But when Mr. Burns literally blocks out the sun and threatens the survival of every living thing in the community, one person pulls a trigger. Either Springfield's population was significantly more measured and controlled in this particular moment than the show has ever depicted them in any other, or the shooting was less spontaneous than the official account suggests. Perhaps it was planned. Perhaps someone with specific knowledge of Burns's schedule, his firearm, and his movements had a considered conversation with themselves about what needed to happen and made a decision before the meeting ever began. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it. The writers stand by it. But the contest that nobody won, the central clue that Burns himself called a coincidence, the fully produced alternate endings, Homer's unexamined confession 12 seasons later, and that final shot of Maggie moving her pacifier in a private gesture that mimics pulling a trigger while carefully checking to make sure no one is watching. All of it suggests that the greatest mystery in the show's history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are two genuinely different outcomes. Let the night do what it does. Slow everything down. There is no urgency here. This next section is about a man who should not exist. Not in the way that any fictional character should not exist because they are fictional, but in the specific internal logic of the show's own universe. Charles Montgomery Burns is a medical impossibility. He is a problem the show has been dancing around for 36 years without ever fully addressing. And when you take all the canonical evidence about his life, his treatments, his history, and his relationship with the institution that keeps him alive, you end up somewhere that is significantly stranger and more disturbing than anything the show has ever said out loud about him. Start with the age question. Burns's birth year has been stated, implied, and then quietly contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places him somewhere in the late 1800s. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has told stories about events from the 19-teens as though he experienced them firsthand. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died decades before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By some readings of the show's continuity, he may be pushing 140. And he does not simply persist in a vegetative state, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with active strategic intent. He manipulates municipal politics. He orchestrates schemes that require long-term planning, sophisticated understanding of modern law and finance, and the sustained cognitive capacity to hold complex plans together across extended periods. His body is visibly failing him in ways that are clearly depicted throughout the show. His physical strength is negligible. He requires Smithers' assistance for basic physical tasks. He is frail in the way that the very old are frail, with a quality of fragility that suggests his body is barely maintaining its current form. But his mind is exceptional. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a calculating precision that nobody in the town can match, across a timeline that should be physiologically impossible for any human mind to sustain. The Springfield Files episode gives us the clearest window into how he does it. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment, the specifics of which the show does not fully detail, but which is described as intensive and chemically significant. After each session, his body emits a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him functional for exactly 7 more days, at which point he requires another dose or he dies. The margin for error is 0. Miss one appointment and the equilibrium collapses. His body shuts down. Burns's continued existence is not a biological given. It is a scheduled maintenance procedure, managed with the precision you would apply to a machine that cannot be allowed to fail. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear facility has built his personal life extension program around controlled exposure to the same type of energy his plant produces. Burns does not simply profit from nuclear power. In a very literal physiological sense, he is powered by it. His body has been so thoroughly altered by over a century of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain its own functions through normal cellular processes. It requires external radiation input the way an ordinary person requires food and water. This is not metaphor. The show depicts it directly. The Three Stooges syndrome scene is one of the most quoted in the series and is typically received as pure comedy. A doctor informs Burns that he has every disease known to medical science simultaneously. Every single illness present in his body at the same time, existing in a state of perfect equilibrium, each one canceling out the effects of all the others. The doctor's analogy is 3 people trying to squeeze through a doorway at the same moment. None of them can get through because they are all blocking each other. Burns's diseases are all trying to kill him simultaneously, and because they are all present at once, they create a biological gridlock that prevents any single condition from gaining dominance. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is the sickest human being in the United States, and also essentially indestructible, because the very multiplicity of things trying to kill him prevents any one of them from succeeding. Under ordinary circumstances, this is a comedy scene. Under the radiation theory, it is a terrifying description of what the weekly treatments are actually doing. The treatments are not curing Burns's diseases. They are managing them, holding them in stasis, keeping every illness in perfect suspension, balanced against every other illness, preventing any individual condition from gaining the dominance it would need to kill him. This is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is functioning like a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. The diseases are the reaction. The radiation is the control system keeping the reaction stable. Smithers is indispensable to this arrangement in ways that go far beyond simple professional loyalty or the complicated personal devotion the show depicts between them. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with the vigilance of someone who fully understands the consequences of missing a single appointment. He monitors Burns's physical condition with an attention to detail that borders on clinical. He ensures that Burns is where he needs to be, when he needs to be there, every single week without exception. The show has established repeatedly and explicitly that if Smithers were ever removed from his position, even temporarily, Burns would quickly become helpless. Not emotionally helpless, physically helpless in ways that would rapidly become fatal. Smithers is not devoted to Burns solely out of complicated personal feeling. He is devoted because he understands that his absence is a death sentence. Without Smithers managing the treatment protocol, Burns misses a dose. The disease equilibrium collapses. Every illness in his body surges forward at once. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through logistical competence. And that knowledge, the understanding that his presence is genuinely what stands between Burns and death, forms the deepest foundation of their relationship. It is not servitude in the conventional sense. It is stewardship of a system that requires constant human maintenance to keep running. Burns's connection to historical events adds another layer to the immortality question. The show has depicted Burns with personal connections to an extraordinary range of historical moments. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, though his role was morally complicated at best. During the war, he came into possession of a $1 trillion bill belonging to the United States government and kept it hidden for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as history he read about but as lived personal experience. He knew Howard Hughes. He has spoken about events from the early 20th century with the casual familiarity of someone describing their own last Tuesday. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty, as the show depicts it, extends back centuries. They were not simply wealthy. They were the kind of wealthy that shapes the physical and economic infrastructure of nations. The kind of wealthy that builds the systems other people then have to pay to use. The kind of wealthy that exists so far beyond ordinary legal accountability that the concept of being held responsible for anything becomes theoretical rather than practical. Burns inherited this legacy and has been extending it for what the show's own timeline suggests is well over a century of active conscious effort. He did not build his empire. He maintained one that was already ancient when he took control of it, which raises a question the show never addresses. If Burns has managed to extend his life by over a century through the application of nuclear technology and wealth, is it possible that previous Burns patriarchs used different methods to achieve similar longevity? If the dynasty has maintained continuous control of its fortune across what the show suggests is centuries, normal generational succession does not fully account for that continuity. Fortunes divide. Heirs make bad decisions. Family empires tend to fracture across generations unless something extraordinary is holding them together. The show does not explore this directly, but it establishes clearly enough that the Burns family has been in continuous, functional, directed control of their wealth for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity requires either extraordinary luck sustained across multiple generations or extraordinary measures. Burns's relationship with death itself is depicted throughout the show in ways that distinguish him clearly from everyone else in Springfield. Homer survives catastrophic injuries through something that reads as cartoon resilience, the show's internal physics simply refusing to allow the main character to die in a non-comedic way. Burns's survivals operate on a different logic entirely. He comes back not through resilience but through infrastructure, through the machinery of extreme wealth that ensures, regardless of what happens to his physical body, there will always be someone standing by with the resources and the expertise to address it. He has been shot, hospitalized, abandoned in the wilderness, poisoned, and attacked in various ways across the show's run. Every time, he returns through the application of money, medical intervention, and the systems he has spent a century building specifically to ensure his own continuation. Homer's immortality in the show is passive. Homer endures things and somehow survives them. Burns's immortality is engineered. Every dollar he has spent across his long life, every institution he has influenced, every politician he has funded, every doctor he has retained, every regulatory structure he has quietly shaped to accommodate his needs, all of it serves the single purpose of keeping the treatments coming and the diseases balanced and the man alive. Because if Burns dies, the empire dies with him. There is no clear succession. There is no designated heir who understands the full system well enough to maintain it. And empires, by their nature, do not allow themselves to die when they can avoid it. They maintain the mechanisms of their own continuation at almost any cost. The most unsettling piece of the Burns immortality theory is not the scale of what it implies about his personal survival. It is the dependency structure it creates around the entire town. Springfield's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on his treatments. The treatments depend on the infrastructure that Burns's wealth enables. Close the loop anywhere and everything collapses. Springfield cannot challenge Burns economically because the town runs on his power. Springfield cannot challenge Burns politically because his money shapes the political structure. Springfield cannot simply wait for him to die because his medical system is robust enough that dying is something Burns is genuinely managing to avoid on a weekly basis. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill in the form of contaminated water and compromised healthcare and a population kept just functional enough to work and consume for as long as Burns can maintain the treatment schedule, which, given the resources available to him, appears to be indefinitely. Stay with me. The room is quiet. This next section is the one that changes how you watch every other episode once you have heard it. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on September 28, 1997, and the reaction was immediate and intense. Fans were angry. Critics were dismissive. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among many other characters, publicly expressed his displeasure with the storyline. 28 years later, it is still regularly cited as the moment The Simpsons betrayed its audience, the point where the writers stopped caring about continuity and internal consistency. It ranks consistently among the most disliked episodes the show has ever produced. But what if everyone has been reading the episode backwards? What if it did not break The Simpsons? What if it revealed what The Simpsons had always been, in a moment of unusual transparency that made viewers uncomfortable precisely because it was honest? Here is what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger walks in, a man no one recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, declared dead, and then escaped to find, decades later, that his identity had been claimed by someone else. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 2 decades is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street punk, a petty criminal from a background that offered him nothing and expected nothing of him. He was drafted into the army and served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt the weight of survivor's guilt. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Agnes, Skinner's mother. But when he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son, and Tamzarian, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth holding on to, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother. He built an entire existence inside a stolen identity and lived it faithfully for 20 years. He ran the school. He endured Agnes. He developed his fraught relationship with Bart. He became a genuine presence in Springfield's civic life. And then the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door and the entire structure collapsed in an instant. Now watch what Springfield does with the truth. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully exposed and universally known. Every resident of Springfield understands that the principal who has been running their school for 20 years, who has been living in their community, who has been attending their town events and managing their children's education, is not who he has claimed to be. The fraud is total. The evidence is sitting in the same room as everyone who was deceived by it. And Springfield votes, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on whether to offer Skinner any kind of restitution for the life that was taken from him while he was imprisoned and fighting to survive. Springfield votes on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous in favor of the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that Armin Tamzarian is henceforth to be considered the real and only Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the genuine man, the war veteran who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life had been claimed in his absence, is physically removed from Springfield, tied to a railroad car, expelled from the community he had returned to, and the judge's decree makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of consequences that the show depicts as genuine legal punishment. A town collectively decided that its comfort was worth more than the truth. They had definitive proof. They had the actual person whose identity was stolen standing in front of them. They chose the fake. They sentenced the truth to exile and criminalized the act of speaking it. Fans despised this. The criticism was that the episode destroyed Skinner as a character by revealing that everything we thought we knew about him was built on a fiction. His military service, his complicated relationship with his mother, his dynamic with Bart, his entire personality, all of it was constructed on top of a stolen life. The episode felt, to many viewers, like an act of contempt toward the audience, a deliberate erasure of continuity and character history that the show had spent 8 seasons establishing. But here is the thing that the episode's critics have consistently missed. The episode is completely honest about what Springfield is and how it operates. It simply says the quiet part out loud in a way the show usually does not. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable collective fiction over uncomfortable individual truth. The town has always agreed, through some unspoken social mechanism, to forget what does not fit the story it wants to tell about itself. The only difference is that this episode shows you the process in real time. It shows you the vote, it shows you the legal decree, it shows you the physical expulsion of the inconvenient truth from the community's borders. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, ignores an impossible contradiction, or resets to normal after something world-altering happens, the process occurs off-screen. The mechanism is invisible. The reset just happens, quietly, between episodes, and you accept it as part of how the show works. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode in the show's entire run that lets you watch the mechanism operate in real time. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should have permanently altered the town's reality. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed beneath a federal dome. It has survived nuclear near misses and environmental catastrophes significant enough to draw federal attention. It has experienced events that, in any realistic fictional universe, would have consequences echoing through every subsequent story. And yet, by the next episode, the slate is clean. Nobody references the previous disaster. Nobody is still processing the dome, or the meltdown, or the flood. Everything is back to the way it was before, with no explanation offered and no explanation requested by any character. The standard industry explanation is episodic storytelling. Shows like this do not carry continuity between episodes by design. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain cycling between states and resetting at the end of each cycle. The radiation theory calls it chronic neurological damage, compromising the population's memory formation. All of these are valid frameworks. The Principal and the Pauper offers a fourth explanation that is perhaps the most interesting of all. Springfield resets between episodes because the town chooses to reset, deliberately, through an ongoing collective social agreement that says, we will not acknowledge what happened, we will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, and we will treat any threat to that version as something to be suppressed and removed from the community. It is not cognitive impairment. It is not dream logic. It is a specific, conscious, communal act of denial performed over and over across 36 years of broadcasting. That is not a cartoon convention. That is how real communities function when they encounter truths they cannot afford to acknowledge. Small towns in particular have a documented capacity for collective silence around uncomfortable realities. Scandals are buried, crimes are forgotten, powerful people are protected, inconvenient histories are rewritten until the official version is the only version anyone feels safe remembering. This is not cynicism, it is sociology. Communities develop self-protective mechanisms, and those mechanisms sometimes produce results that look, from the outside, like denial or complicity. Springfield's amnesia is not a glitch in the show's internal logic. It is a feature of Springfield's social architecture. It is how the town survives, knowing what it knows. If the residents of Springfield genuinely stopped and held in their minds simultaneously all the things that have happened to their community, all the contamination and the cover-ups and the institutional corruption and the biological impossibilities they move through every day, the cognitive weight of that awareness would be unbearable. So they do not hold it simultaneously. They hold whatever is directly in front of them right now and allow the rest to fade. If the coma theory is also true, this episode takes on an additional dimension. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire town votes to legally sustain a comfortable lie over a documented truth. And the reason Homer's mind invented this particular scenario is because it is the thing he needs most to believe. He needs to believe that lies can be maintained indefinitely through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a fake version of a life can stand in for the real one and eventually become indistinguishable from it. He needs to believe that the people who love someone can agree to keep a fiction alive rather than confront what the fiction is hiding, because Homer's coma is itself a fiction of that kind, a dream pretending to be a life, a simulation standing in for reality. And as long as nobody in the dream questions it, as long as the dream version of Springfield keeps voting to maintain the comfortable version of events, Homer does not have to wake up and find out what is real on the other side. The real Seymour Skinner was the last honest man in a town that made honesty a punishable offense. He arrived with documentation. He had evidence. He was the truth, walking through the door. And Springfield tied him to a train and sent him away. Because truth is only valuable if the community is willing to absorb its consequences, and Springfield has decided the consequences are too expensive. Armin Tamzarian is still Principal Skinner. Springfield is still pretending it always was. And somewhere out there, the real Seymour Skinner is still riding away from the town that exiled him for the crime of existing. Let your breathing slow. This is a gentle one, or it starts that way. The mysteries around the quietest member of the Simpson family take a while to fully arrive, but once they do, they stay. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates through pacifier movements, the occasional pointed stare, and a quality of attention in her eyes that the show's animators return to again and again, usually at precisely the moments when an attentive viewer might wonder what is going on behind that expressionless face. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, without saying a single meaningful word, she has accomplished more than any other member of her family. She shot a billionaire. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations through timely interventions that required planning and execution under pressure. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed those of adult characters who are supposed to be competent. She was evaluated for intelligence and found to possess cognitive capacity that the tests used to measure it could not adequately contain. And through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has maintained her silence. Not because she lacks the capacity to speak, because she chooses not to. The shooting is where most discussions of Maggie begin, but it is actually the least interesting thing about her in a certain sense. Because the most interesting part of the shooting is not whether Maggie pulled the trigger, it is what happens in the final shot of the episode. After Burns has identified his attacker, after the police have closed the case, after the family has gone home, after everyone has left the room, Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully and deliberately, taking the time to confirm that nobody is watching her. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics pulling a trigger. That sequence of actions requires several things that are not supposed to be present in a 1-year-old child. It requires situational awareness of who is and is not in the room. It requires memory of an event that has emotional or experiential significance. It requires caution, a recognition that performing this gesture in the presence of witnesses would be inadvisable. And it requires impulse control, the ability to wait until the conditions are safe before repeating the action. That is not reflexive infant behavior. That is deliberate, considered, private commemoration of something the baby understands to have been significant. The Longest Daycare is a theatrical short film released in 2012, nominated for an Academy Award, and it is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating cognitive abilities that would be remarkable in an adult operating under pressure, let alone in a baby who has not yet learned to form sentences. The premise is straightforward. Maggie is dropped off at a rigidly administered daycare facility. She encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another infant named Gerald wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the staff, and the facility's security systems in sequence, ultimately saving the butterfly and releasing it into the world outside. She does all of this without speaking. She operates entirely through observation, planning, improvisation, and the kind of adaptive real-time problem-solving that most adults struggle with under conditions far less stressful than those she is navigating. She reads the environment for available resources and potential threats. She identifies constraints and works within and around them. She develops strategies on the fly and adjusts them when initial approaches fail. She executes multi-step plans that require precise timing, spatial awareness, and the ability to predict other people's behavior accurately enough to use it against them. Her body is the limiting factor throughout. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls when her plan requires her to move faster. Her physical development genuinely cannot keep pace with what her mind is trying to accomplish. But her decision-making remains clear and accurate throughout. Every choice she makes in the short is the optimal choice for the situation she is in. She does not panic. She does not hesitate past the point of usefulness. She succeeds because her intelligence compensates for every physical limitation her age imposes on her. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence more directly across various episodes, with results that range from impressive to essentially off the measurable scale, depending on which episode you look at. The pattern is consistent enough that it cannot be attributed entirely to episodic inconsistency. Maggie regularly demonstrates cognitive abilities that no standard infant assessment tool would expect to find in a 1-year-old child. But the family does not notice. The community does not notice. Maggie operates in the space that powerful people and systems always create unintentionally, the space just below active surveillance. Homer is too loud and chaotic to be genuinely perceptive. Marge is too busy managing everyone else to maintain close attention to the child who seems most self-sufficient. Bart and Lisa have their own defining struggles that consume their attention. And so Maggie sits quietly in the center of the family's ongoing drama, watching everything, absorbing everything, processing everything, and saying nothing. The theory about why she chooses silence is the most compelling part of her story. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is exceptional. She is by any measure a genius, operating at a cognitive level that places her far above every adult in her immediate environment and most of the adults in Springfield. She has pursued intellectual and ethical development with a consistency and seriousness that borders on the heroic when you consider how little support she receives for it. And what has that visible intelligence produced for her? Isolation? Mockery? A consistent pattern of being dismissed, talked over, or treated as a nuisance by the people around her who are supposed to love and support her. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and faces consequences. Lisa tries to improve the conditions of her community and encounters the full weight of a community that is deeply invested in remaining exactly as it is. Lisa's intelligence is her defining gift and the primary source of her suffering because she uses it visibly. She announces herself. She makes herself known as the most intellectually capable person in whatever room she occupies, and the room consistently responds by demonstrating how little that matters. Maggie has watched this happen. From the earliest days of her conscious awareness, Maggie has had a front-row position to observe what visible intelligence produces in the Simpson household. She has watched her sister fight every single day for recognition and receive frustration and resistance and loneliness in return. She has watched the most genuinely exceptional person in the family be consistently undervalued by a household and a community that reward what is familiar and comfortable and non-threatening. And Maggie, who is smarter than Lisa by the show's own implied measure, has drawn a completely different conclusion from the same evidence. Silence is protection. Invisibility is the most effective armor available. The less anyone notices you, the more you are free to accomplish without interference. Lisa fights loudly and gets blocked at every turn. Maggie operates in the margins and succeeds repeatedly where her sister cannot. The daycare rebellion succeeded because adults do not monitor infants closely enough to see them organizing. The Burns investigation never seriously considered her because investigators do not treat one-year-olds as credible actors. Every act of heroism or exceptional capability Maggie demonstrates happens in the space where nobody is paying close enough attention to see it clearly. She has engineered her own invisibility. She maintains the disguise of being exactly what the world expects from an infant: passive, helpless, dependent, uncomplicated. She is none of those things. She has simply made the strategic decision that being perceived as all of those things is more valuable to her than being recognized as what she actually is. Connect this to the radiation theory and it becomes something genuinely interesting. If Springfield's environmental contamination produces mutations that affect each resident differently, then Maggie and Homer represent the two poles of a spectrum. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to a clinically significant degree. Maggie's mutation amplified hers to a level that cannot be easily measured. Same cause, same family. Same contaminated water and irradiated air and daily proximity to the power plant's output. But the effect on the father's brain diminished it while the effect on the youngest daughter's brain appears to have supercharged it. They are two sides of what the same environmental condition can do to human biology when it operates across different individuals. Under the coma theory, Maggie's genius takes on a different emotional quality. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of an unconscious father's mind trying to preserve his family in the only way still available to him, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities might be understood as Homer's most private hope for his youngest child, projected into the dream because he cannot witness the reality. He cannot see her grow. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot learn what kind of person she becomes after the coma takes him away from her. And so, in the dream, he gives her everything. He makes her capable beyond her years, capable beyond what should be possible, capable of protecting herself and protecting the family even without him there to do it. Her genius is not a mutation in this reading. It is a father's prayer encoded into a dream. Maggie has not yet shown Springfield what she is truly capable of in any definitive final sense. She has given glimpses. She has acted when action was required, and then returned to stillness and silence before anyone could look too closely at what just happened. She is waiting for something, the show has never told us what, and the watching is patient and unhurried in the way that genuinely confident intelligence tends to be patient and unhurried. Behind the pacifier, behind 36 years of deliberate silence, something is thinking, something is watching, something is accumulating an understanding of Springfield's full architecture, its corruptions and its mechanisms, and its power structures and its quiet agreements to forget the things that are too difficult to remember. And when Maggie finally chooses to act in some definitive way, Springfield will not see it coming. That is precisely how she designed it. The power plant's violations extend far beyond the scope of what any single episode presents in detail. The show gives you individual glimpses, the plutonium paperweight here, the glowing rats there, and it trusts that the audience will not add them all up into a coherent picture. But when you do add them up, when you sit with the full accounting of what those 342 violations represent across the physical infrastructure of the facility and the bodies of the people living near it, the number stops being funny and starts being something else. Consider what we know about the plant's water management. Multiple episodes depict radioactive waste being discharged into the river system near Springfield. Blinky, the three-eyed fish, is the visible result of this discharge in the waterways. But the discharge does not stop at the river. Water cycles. Groundwater absorbs surface contamination. Drinking water aquifers connect to the broader water table. The specific mechanism by which Springfield's municipal water reaches its residents has never been examined within the show's canon. But the assumption that contaminated surface water stays in the river and does not reach the town's supply requires a geological optimism that the evidence does not support. Springfield residents drink that water. They cook with it. They bathe in it. Their children have been drinking it since birth. And we know, because the show tells us directly, that the fish in the river near the plant have 3 eyes. The question nobody asks inside the show, and that the show never answers directly, is what the same water has done to the tissues of the organisms that have been consuming it for 20 or 30 years, including the tissues of every human being in Springfield. Homer's particular physical presentation adds another layer to this when you look at it specifically. His pain response is documented as dramatically impaired throughout the show. He has been struck, burned, electrocuted, dropped from heights, had heavy objects land on him, and in essentially every case, his physiological response to this damage is either absent or extraordinarily brief. He registers pain in the moment, often comically, but recovers within seconds or minutes from injuries that would incapacitate a normal person for days. This is played as a running gag about Homer's resilience, but under the radiation theory, it reads as a symptom. Chronic radiation exposure at certain levels can affect nerve function. It can alter the way pain signals are transmitted and processed. Homer's superhuman pain tolerance is not a cartoon exaggeration. It is a clinical presentation. The thyroid gland is the organ most sensitive to radioactive iodine, one of the most common byproducts of nuclear reactor operation. Radioactive iodine concentrates specifically in thyroid tissue. Disruption of thyroid function produces a wide range of metabolic effects, including effects on cognitive function, weight regulation, mood, and energy levels. Homer's weight, his cognitive presentation, his emotional volatility, his persistent difficulty with motivation and sustained attention, all of these are consistent with a profile of thyroid disruption that would be expected in someone with chronic, low-level radioactive iodine exposure over decades. The show never makes this explicit. It never says Homer is metabolically compromised by radioactive iodine contamination from the water supply. But it shows you the result of something in his biology that produces exactly the profile you would expect from that kind of exposure, and it places him inside the exact environment that would produce it. Lisa's biological resilience, by contrast, is different in character. Lisa does not display Homer's superhuman physical recovery. She is not shown surviving impossible injuries, but she displays a cognitive acuity, a sharpness and speed of analysis, and a depth of critical thinking that exceeds anyone else in her immediate environment by a margin that is difficult to account for through normal genetic inheritance from two parents whose measured intelligence is considerably more modest. Under the radiation theory, if contamination can diminish cognitive function in one member of the family, the possibility that it amplifies function in another through different mechanisms is not inherently less plausible. Radiation's effects on biological systems are not uniform. They depend on dose, duration, specific tissue type, individual genetic susceptibility, and a range of other variables that are not fully predictable. Homer and Lisa represent the two ends of what the same environmental condition can do when it interacts with different biological systems in different ways. Maggie, as we will address in her own section, presents a third outcome from the same cause. The seasonal episodes add an interesting dimension to the contamination theory. Springfield's environment responds to the plant's output in ways that the show depicts as background comedy, but that accumulate into a pattern. The wildlife around Springfield displays unusual characteristics with regularity. The soil in certain areas near the plant produces unusual plant growth. The weather patterns in the vicinity of the facility behave unpredictably in ways that the show attributes to Homer's weather-related misadventures, but that could also be explained by the thermal output of a poorly managed reactor. Nuclear facilities produce significant waste heat as a byproduct of their operation. A facility as poorly managed as Burns's plant, with cracked cooling infrastructure and no effective thermal regulation, would produce thermal pollution in the surrounding environment that could affect local weather patterns in ways that the show depicts but never contextualizes. The fish are just the most visible symptom. The ecosystem around Springfield is showing signs of pressure from the plant's output at every level the show bothers to depict. And the human community living inside that ecosystem has been absorbing those same pressures for decades without the benefit of any official acknowledgement that the pressures exist. Burns's medical situation, the weekly treatments, the disease equilibrium, the glowing body that wanders through the woods after each session, provides the clearest window into what managed versus unmanaged radiation exposure looks like as an outcome. Burns has resources, he has medical infrastructure, he has pharmaceutical capacity and personal physicians, and the ability to design and maintain a treatment protocol that keeps his specific radiation-related biological changes within a survivable range. He manages his exposure the way an engineer manages a controlled reaction. He knows what he is working with, he knows the parameters, and he has the resources to stay within them. The residents of Springfield have none of that. They have no knowledge that their exposure is occurring. They have no access to the kind of medical monitoring that would detect early signs of radiation-related biological changes. They have no treatment infrastructure for the effects they are experiencing. They have a healthcare system that operates within a community economically dominated by the person responsible for the exposure. And they have Homer in the safety inspector role, ensuring that the violations continue and the monitoring that might reveal what is happening does not get performed. The radiation theory is not a theory about one dramatic, catastrophic event. It is a theory about the cumulative effect of chronic low-level exposure maintained over decades in a community that has never been given the information that would allow it to respond to what is happening to its bodies. The structure of the coma theory becomes more compelling when you examine the specific changes in how the show handles Homer's relationship with mortality after April of 1993. Before the coma episode, Homer's encounters with danger have a different quality than they do in later seasons. The early episodes do not treat Homer as indestructible. They treat him as a man in difficult circumstances who occasionally faces serious risk and who responds to that risk with the kind of fear and vulnerability that real people have. His physical limitations are acknowledged and they feel real within the show's universe. He is not superhuman in the early seasons. He is a heavy-set, middle-aged man with limited physical capability and genuine susceptibility to injury. After the coma episode, something changes in how the show depicts Homer's relationship with physical damage. He begins to survive things that in any previous episode context would have been presented as genuinely serious if not fatal. Falls that increase in their distance and their violence. Impacts that should produce significant injury. Situations that are presented as comedically impossible rather than as dangerous. The shift is gradual and not absolute. There are later episodes that handle Homer's danger with some of the earlier show's seriousness, but the trajectory is clear. Homer becomes progressively more indestructible as the seasons continue. Under the coma theory, this makes perfect internal sense. Homer is dreaming, the dream is generated by his unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind will not allow the dreamer to be permanently damaged within the dream. The mind cannot kill its own dreamer. Every time Homer faces danger in the post-coma episodes, the dream ensures that he survives it, because the alternative is an ending that Homer's mind is not prepared to construct. The escalating implausibility of Homer's survival across later seasons is not the writers getting lazier about physical reality. It is the dream's increasing willingness to abandon physical reality in service of the dreamer's survival. In the early post-coma seasons, the dream still has enough internal coherence to maintain something like plausible survival mechanics. In later seasons, as the dreaming mind loses resolution and the dream degrades in coherence, the survival mechanics become less and less tethered to anything physically recognizable. Homer falls from heights that no human body could survive. He walks away from explosions that should be fatal. He endures damage that would kill multiple ordinary people, and none of it leaves any lasting mark on his body or his life. The mind protecting the dreamer, with increasingly little concern for the physics that should govern the outcomes. The celebrity appearances in later seasons deserve additional examination through this lens. In the show's early years, celebrity guest appearances were occasional and felt like events. They were used sparingly and they tended to serve specific narrative functions. After the coma episode, the guest appearance rate increases substantially. By the later seasons, celebrity cameos have become a near-weekly occurrence, with famous people appearing in Springfield with a frequency that strains any realistic interpretation of why famous people would keep visiting a small, Midwestern town. Under the coma theory, the frequency of celebrity appearances tracks with something specific. Homer is in a hospital room. The hospital room is not silent. Televisions play, conversations happen, music comes from somewhere. News programs discuss public figures. Visitors might mention names and events from the outside world. Homer's unconscious mind absorbs these fragments and incorporates them into the dream, because the dream needs content to continue and the external world provides it. In the early post-coma seasons, the ambient input is limited. The hospital might be quieter. The family might visit less frequently as the weeks and months pass with no change in Homer's condition. The celebrity appearances in the dream reflect whatever stimuli are reaching Homer through the coma fog. As the years accumulate, as television culture becomes more saturated with celebrity content, and as the ambient noise of the hospital room reflects a world that is increasingly obsessed with famous people, the dream incorporates more of what it receives. The celebrity flood in later seasons is not the writers pandering to an audience hungry for famous faces. It is Homer's comatose brain receiving an increasingly celebrity-saturated cultural environment through the imperfect filter of unconsciousness and doing its best to integrate what it hears. The tonal difference between early and later seasons also reflects something specific about what long-term unconsciousness does to the mind's capacity for narrative generation. In the early post-coma seasons, Homer's dream still has access to relatively fresh and detailed memories of the real world. The dreams it generates have specificity and internal consistency because the material being drawn on is recent and well-preserved. His sense of his family, his neighborhood, his workplace, all of it is vivid enough to generate stories that feel grounded in something recognizable. As the years of unconsciousness accumulate, the memories degrade, the details soften, the edges of what Homer knew clearly become blurrier. The dream compensates for the loss of specific detail by becoming more expansive, more abstract, more willing to generate scenarios that bear less resemblance to any lived reality because the lived reality it was drawing on is becoming harder to access. The increasingly surreal quality of later seasons is the dream becoming less tethered to memory and more dependent on improvisation. Which is to say, The Simpsons got weird because Homer's brain got tired. The contest failure, when you examine it carefully, reveals something about the relationship between the show's writers and the mystery they created that complicates the official answer considerably. The contest was designed and promoted on the premise that the clues in Part 1 were sufficient. The show's marketing explicitly told viewers that the information necessary to solve the mystery was available in the first episode. This was not a vague promise about the episode containing hints. It was a specific claim about the solvability of the puzzle from its presented evidence. If that claim was accurate, and the clues in Part 1 genuinely pointed toward Maggie as the shooter, why did essentially nobody in the viewing audience arrive at that conclusion independently? The selection of entries was random, and the sample was substantial. The failure to find any winners suggests one of two things. Either the claim about the puzzle's solvability was not accurate, which would mean the mystery was less fairly constructed than the promotion implied, or the clues in Part 1 did not logically point toward Maggie, which would mean the official answer was not the answer those clues were designed to produce. Consider what the episode established about the shooting's physical circumstances. Burns was shot with his own weapon. The holster was shown empty before the attack. establishing that the gun had been separated from Burns prior to the moment it was used. The attacker was someone who did not arrive armed. The attacker encountered the gun by chance. Burns recognized his attacker with a relaxed familiarity, not with alarm. These are the clues that survived the final edit of Part 1, and that the audience was theoretically meant to use. Working from these clues to the conclusion that a 1-year-old baby shot Burns requires accepting several things simultaneously. That Burns would recognize Maggie with the relaxed familiarity of seeing a familiar acquaintance. That the baby found the gun on the ground in the parking lot. That the gun discharged during a struggle over a lollipop rather than through deliberate firing. That the DNA evidence pointing to a Simpson was Maggie's eyelash rather than Homer's, despite the episode having established Homer as having the strongest motive and being under the most significant emotional pressure. That the sundial clue pointed to Maggie Simpson despite Burns subsequently clarifying that his hand's position on the sundial was accidental. None of these require extraordinary logical leaps individually, but the combination of them as the intended solution to a puzzle the audience was told it could solve from Part 1 requires a specific inferential path that the contest results suggest essentially nobody followed, which suggests either that the path was not as clear as the promotion implied, or that the answer was decided after the clues were established rather than before. The Smithers alternate ending is the clearest evidence that the answer was not predetermined. A complete alternate resolution was not a rough draft or a script outline. It was a finished, voiced, animated alternate version of the episode's conclusion. This means the writers, at some point in the production process, were genuinely uncertain enough about which ending to use that they produced both to completion before making the final selection. The uncertainty was not theoretical. It was practical enough to warrant the production cost of 2 full endings. If the answer had been decided before Part 1 was written, before the clues were established, the production of a complete alternate ending makes less sense. You produce alternate endings when you are genuinely uncertain about which conclusion serves the story better. The existence of a fully produced Smithers ending suggests the writers were uncertain about Maggie until relatively late in the production of Part 2. Homer's confession in Season 18 is the element the show most clearly wants you to ignore. He states directly that he shot Burns. The show does not frame this as a joke that requires unpacking. He says it. And then the scene continues, and nobody reacts to it as though he has just confessed to an attempted murder. The absence of any reaction from the characters around him is itself interesting. Either everyone who hears it considers it obviously false, which would suggest the confession is being read as Homer's typical attention-seeking behavior, or the absence of reaction reflects something the show has long since decided it does not want to examine too closely. The final image of the episode, Maggie alone and checking before she reenacts the gesture, deserves one more consideration. The framing of that shot is precise. The camera lingers. The show draws attention to the moment, rather than treating it as incidental background action. The attention is deliberate. The question is whether the attention is meant to confirm or to complicate. The show uses its camera the same way a writer uses emphasis, to direct the audience toward what it wants them to conclude. The camera's attention on Maggie in that moment is the show's hand on your shoulder, pointing you toward the official answer. But the deliberateness of the direction is itself a kind of tell. You do not linger on a shot that is meant to close a question. You linger on a shot that is meant to raise one. The question of what Burns knew about the plant's effect on Springfield, and when he knew it, is one the show implies an answer to without ever stating it directly. Burns has been managing the effects of radiation exposure on his own biology for his entire adult life. He understands from intimate personal experience what prolonged proximity to nuclear material does to living tissue. He has physicians who study this question in relation to his specific case. He has pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of designing interventions for radiation-related biological changes. His body is his ongoing experiment in what radiation does to the human organism at various doses and durations. He also owns the facility that has been exposing Springfield's residents to uncontrolled radiation output for decades. He knows the plant's output. He knows its violations. He knows that his own body required extraordinary medical intervention to survive its radiation exposure, and he knows that Springfield's residents are experiencing unmanaged versions of similar exposure without any of the resources he has deployed to manage his own. The logical conclusion, which the show invites but never states, is that Burns knows exactly what the plant is doing to the population of Springfield. He has known for a long time. and his decision to continue operating the plant in its current condition, his refusal to spend the $56 million to bring it into compliance, his active use of Homer in the safety inspector role to ensure the violations continue, is not negligence. It is a considered strategic choice made by someone who understands the full consequences of that choice. The population's cognitive impairment, if it is a consequence of the contamination, serves Burns's interest directly and specifically. A population whose critical thinking is compromised by chronic neurological damage is a population that is significantly less likely to organize effective resistance to the conditions it is living in. A population whose memory is affected by the same damage is a population that will not sustain collective anger about revealed problems long enough for that anger to produce meaningful political or legal consequences. A population that cannot quite connect the available evidence into a coherent picture of what is happening to them is a population that Burns can continue to exploit indefinitely. Homer is the most visible example of this within the show. Burns's treatment of Homer, the years of being forgotten, the documented disregard, the absolute indifference to Homer as a person rather than as a function, should by any reasonable standard produce a response from Homer. He should, by this point, have filed complaints or sought other employment or confronted Burns directly. He has all the motivation he would need. He lacks the sustained cognitive capacity to translate that motivation into effective action, which is, from Burns's perspective, the ideal employee. The deal that Burns struck with Grandpa Simpson, the secret contractual guarantee of Homer's permanent employment in exchange for Abe's silence about a crime, is the show's most direct confirmation that Homer's presence at the plant is not an accident of the labor market. It is an engineered outcome. Burns needed Homer in that specific role. He built the contractual infrastructure to ensure Homer stayed in it regardless of his performance. And the reason Homer was the right person for this arrangement was that Homer was already the right kind of damaged. Already the right combination of motivated to keep the job and incapable of doing it well enough to disrupt the violations it was generating. Burns did not just find a convenient, incompetent employee, he manufactured one. Or, more precisely, he created the conditions that manufactured one by driving Mona Simpson underground before Homer was old enough to develop the emotional and cognitive foundation that a more protected childhood might have given him. The Skinner mystery within the episode opens questions about Springfield's institutional memory that extend well beyond the specific case of Armin Tamzarian. If Springfield has the institutional capacity to vote to legally redefine someone's identity and to criminalize the mention of the truth, then this capacity has presumably been available to the community before the Skinner episode and continues to be available after it. The Skinner case is the only time the show depicts this capacity explicitly, but there is no reason to believe it was deployed only once in the town's history. Consider every occasion on which Springfield has collectively forgotten something that should have permanently altered its reality. Every reset, every episode where a catastrophic event leaves no trace in the following week's storyline, every moment where the town moves on from something that would have been impossible to simply move on from in any realistic community. Each of these resets could be understood not as an artifact of episodic storytelling, but as evidence of a community that has access to and regularly uses the mechanism the Skinner episode depicts. Not through formal votes and legal decrees every time. The formal process was only used in the Skinner case because the truth arrived with a human face attached to it, in the form of the real Seymour Skinner standing in the room. Usually the truth is more diffuse. Usually it can be managed through the softer mechanisms of shared inattention and mutual agreement not to bring something up. The Skinner episode is the exceptional case where the truth was too concrete and too embodied to be managed through the normal, informal mechanisms. It required the formal machinery of legal decree and physical expulsion because the evidence could not simply be collectively ignored when it was standing there in person, demanding acknowledgement. Every other reset is the informal version of the same process. Springfield has always been voting, through its collective behavior, to maintain the agreed version of events. The Skinner episode just made the voting visible. This reframing of the reset mechanism changes how you understand the show's relationship with its own continuity. The continuity errors and the episodic resets that critics have complained about for decades are not failures of craft. They are accurate depictions of how Springfield operates. A community that has formally voted to make truth illegal does not experience cognitive dissonance when it forgets things that would be inconvenient to remember. It just does not remember them. because remembering them would require acknowledging that the agreed version of events was wrong, and Springfield has already decided that the agreed version of events takes precedence over the evidence. The residents of Springfield are not credulous or stupid in the sense of failing to perceive things that are clearly in front of them. They perceive things, they process them, and then they make the same decisions Springfield made about Seymour Skinner. They vote to keep the lie. Not through any formal deliberation, but through the accumulated weight of individual decisions to not be the person who insists too loudly on the inconvenient version. The real Seymour Skinner is the model for what happens to anyone who insists too loudly. He comes with evidence. He is the truth, literally embodied and present in the room. And Springfield ties him to a train and sends him away. The lesson is available to every resident of the town. If you push too hard against the agreed version of reality in Springfield, you get removed from the community. Not metaphorically removed. Actually removed. Put on a train and sent somewhere else. This is the most effective deterrent imaginable against the kind of sustained individual resistance that might otherwise build into collective pressure for change. Nobody wants to be tied to a train, so nobody insists too loudly. And the agreed version of events continues to be the only version most people feel safe remembering. Settle in, the room is soft. This one is going to ask you to hold two contradictory feelings at the same time, which is not so difficult when you are lying still in the dark with nothing demanding your attention. The Simpsons has been predicting the future. That is the story the internet tells about the show every few months when a new clip surfaces. Every time something from an episode that aired a decade or two ago aligns with something that just happened in the actual world. The story has been circulating long enough and with enough repetition that even people who have never watched a single episode of the show know about it in a general way. The Simpsons predicted Trump. The Simpsons predicted the Disney acquisition. The Simpsons predicted smartwatches. The Simpsons predicted the pandemic. The claim has become part of the show's cultural identity in its later years, possibly more defining than any individual storyline or character arc from its recent seasons. But tonight we are going to do something the viral clips do not do. We are going to sit with the prediction phenomenon all the way to its edges, including the parts that complicate the clean narrative, and see what is actually there. Let us start with the ones you have already seen shared. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future timeline in which Lisa Simpson becomes President of the United States. In that same episode, she inherits a significant budget deficit from her predecessor, who is identified as having been Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the presidential election in 2016. 16 years before the thing the episode treats as a punchline about the absurd direction American celebrity culture was heading. The clip was shared so widely in the days following the election that it effectively became the defining image of the prediction phenomenon. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in years were sharing screenshots. People who had never watched it were encountering it for the first time through this specific moment. In a 1995 episode, a character is shown using a device that strongly resembles a modern smartwatch. In a 1998 episode, a character interacts with a mathematical equation that appears to anticipate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which would not be confirmed experimentally until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and years later, cosmologists identified radiation patterns that suggested the universe might have a toroidal structure. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing panic buying and a desperate search for a cure, 27 years before the actual global pandemic of 2020. During the chaos of that fictional outbreak, the townspeople accidentally release a swarm of bees, which felt strangely resonant when Asian giant hornets were discovered in the United States in the spring of 2020, and immediately dubbed murder hornets by media outlets. In 1996, an episode called Homer Palooza featured a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. That exact event, Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, actually happened in 2024, 28 years between the joke and the reality. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted the media conglomerate Disney acquiring the entertainment company Fox, which is the same company that produces The Simpsons. That acquisition actually happened in 2019. The show had depicted its own corporate absorption 21 years before it occurred. The list is long enough to fill its own dedicated examination, and every time a new entry is added to it, the internet responds with the same mixture of genuine amazement and conspiratorial excitement. How do they know? Is this prediction or something else? Is there something unusual happening with the people who write this show? The people who write this show have been asked this question many times. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer since the show's earliest seasons, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly, and his explanation is concise. If you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the board. That is the official position from inside the show. Volume and statistical probability. The Simpsons has produced close to 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains multiple jokes, references, satirical observations, and speculative extrapolations about technology, politics, culture, and human behavior. When you generate that volume of content over that long a period, the mathematical expectation is that some portion of it will align with future events. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it in specific terms. There are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something. Most of it is coincidence because the episodes are old enough that history simply repeats itself. Fact-checking organizations have examined many of the most widely shared prediction claims and found that a significant number of them are based on misremembered details, creative editing of clips to emphasize alignment with real events, or simply a very loose definition of what counts as a prediction. The Trump episode, for example, is frequently described as predicting a Trump presidency, but Trump had been publicly discussing and flirting with presidential campaigns since the late 1980s. The show's writers were not extrapolating from a fringe possibility. They were observing something that was already a recurring public conversation and taking it to its logical comedic conclusion. The Disney-Fox prediction looks striking until you know that media consolidation was an accelerating and openly discussed trend in the entertainment industry for decades before the acquisition actually happened. The writers did not have special information. They had the same information anyone paying attention to the industry had, and they followed the trend line to an outcome that was already visible in the patterns of corporate behavior being reported on regularly. The smartwatch, the video calling, the autocorrect failures, the surveillance culture references, all of these are extrapolations from technology trends that were already visible in their early forms when the episodes were written. The writers did not invent the idea of a wrist-mounted computer. They observed that personal electronics were getting smaller and more integrated, and imagined one step further along that trajectory. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most educated in American television. Writers with degrees from Harvard, Yale, and similar institutions. Writers with backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, political science, and other fields that train people to identify patterns in data and follow their implications. These are not people making random guesses. They are highly trained observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying trends, analyzing systems, and pushing the implications of current conditions forward to find the comic possibilities waiting at the end of each trajectory. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then extending it forward a few logical steps. But here is where the phenomenon becomes genuinely interesting, rather than simply explainable. Because the debunking, even when it is accurate, does not fully account for the precision of certain specific coincidences. The Trump prediction did not simply forecast that a celebrity might seek political power. It specified Trump, by name, in a role that was being treated as an obvious joke about how far American celebrity culture could go. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just observe that exotic animals used in entertainment present physical risks to handlers. It depicted in specific detail a white tiger attacking one of two performers during a live show, which is almost exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance in Las Vegas. These are not vague trend extrapolations that happen to rhyme loosely with later events. These are specific details that align with specific real-world outcomes in ways that are difficult to fully account for with purely statistical reasoning. And this is where the meta-theory becomes more interesting than any straightforward conspiracy or supernatural explanation. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. The show has been running for 36 years and has been one of the most watched, most quoted, and most culturally embedded pieces of American media across that entire period. Its jokes have become part of the American vocabulary. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand and describe their own culture. Its specific images and scenarios have accumulated in the collective cultural imagination with a staying power that almost nothing else from the same era has managed to maintain. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke does not disappear after the episode airs. It enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference. It becomes a shorthand. It becomes something people say at dinner parties and remember when they see Trump on the news and share when the political conversation reaches a particular moment. The joke does not predict the future. The joke makes certain futures feel familiar before they arrive. It primes the cultural imagination in the direction of specific possibilities, making them feel less like shocking discontinuities and more like inevitable punchlines that were always going to land eventually. When the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, the experience is not one of being surprised by something new. It is one of recognition. We already knew this. The Simpsons already told us. The show did not forecast the event. The show made the event feel already known. The Disney-Fox merger is a clean example of this. The Simpsons made a joke about Disney absorbing Fox as a satirical observation about where media consolidation was heading. The joke normalized the idea. It made the concept of a Disney entertainment empire that swallowed its major competitors feel like an obvious, almost predetermined outcome, the kind of thing a sharp observer would have seen coming long ago. When the merger actually happened, the cultural response was not shock. It was a collective shrug of recognition. Of course they did. We already knew this was coming. The Simpsons already showed us. The show did not forecast the future. The show made certain futures feel inevitable by treating them as already concluded, as foregone punchlines, as things that were already true even before they were. And Springfield has not been reflecting America all this time. America has been gradually becoming Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and we looked into it so consistently and for so long that we began to resemble what we saw reflected back at us. The nuclear power plant managed by willful incompetence. The corrupt billionaire too wealthy to face accountability. The government too disorganized and too captured by money to protect the people it is supposed to serve. The population too distracted by immediate pleasure to notice how systematically they are being exploited. The endless cycle of disaster and reset, catastrophe and amnesia, damage and restoration to the previous status quo. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was when the show began. But there is a final dimension of the prediction phenomenon that is worth sitting with before we move on. The Simpsons has also produced an enormous number of jokes that have not come true. Predictions about jetpacks and moon colonies and technological developments that never materialized. Predictions about political outcomes that went in the opposite direction. Jokes about cultural shifts that simply did not happen. Extrapolations of trends that stalled or reversed before reaching the conclusions the show suggested they would reach. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds viral threads around the predictions that missed. Nobody constructs elaborate theories about the episodes that got it wrong. Confirmation bias works in only one direction. We remember the hits. We forget the misses. We give the hits significance and allow the misses to fade into the background noise of nearly 800 episodes. And when you apply that selective memory to a show with this much content, what you end up with is a highlight reel curated by the internet to look like prophecy. The predictions are not supernatural. They are not the product of time travelers or prophets or any mysterious access to future information. They are the natural result of a brilliantly written show running for an impossibly long time, staffed by highly intelligent observers of American culture, producing more satirical content than any other show in television history, and then having that content filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever built, which is the contemporary internet. But even knowing exactly how the mechanism works, knowing the statistical math and the selection bias, and the trend extrapolation that account for most of it, it is still something to witness. 800 episodes. 36 years? Thousands of satirical observations about American life, and enough accurate alignments with future events to make even the show's own creators pause sometimes and wonder whether they know something they are not entirely sure how they came to know. The mystery of the predictions is not that the show has access to the future. The mystery is that the show has been watching the present so carefully for so long that the future keeps walking into frame. The room is dark. Outside is quiet. This is the section that connects things that the show has always treated as separate And once you see the connection, it becomes one of the saddest stories in the entire run of The Simpsons. For the first 6 seasons of the show, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official family history. Abe Simpson had told Homer, when Homer was still a child, that his mother had passed away. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned in the way that small children mourn things they do not yet fully understand, which is to say, incompletely, with a gap in the understanding that later becomes a gap in the person. Homer grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had died, and whose father was too emotionally withdrawn and too limited in his own ways to fill the space she left behind. That belief became the foundation of Homer's personality in ways that the show does not always make explicit but that explain almost everything about how he moves through the world. His desperate need to be liked by the people around him, his clinginess toward Marge and his terror of the particular kind of abandonment that looks like indifference, his willingness to endure humiliation and disregard from his employer rather than risk the consequences of creating conflict, his compulsive need for approval from people who frequently do not notice him, his deep, genuine love for his children expressed through a fumbling clumsiness that is both comic and heartbreaking. Homer Simpson's entire personality is, at its root, a coping mechanism for maternal loss. And the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. Season 7, Episode 7, November 19th, 1995. It is widely considered one of the greatest episodes in the show's history, and for good reason. Here is what happens. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday. He pushes a dummy off a cliff near the power plant, and the town declares him dead. Marge insists he go to the Hall of Records to correct the official record before any legal complications arise from it. And when Homer stands at the records office looking for his own file, he notices something he was never supposed to find. According to the municipal records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed Homer as a child was not hers. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. For Homer's entire life, his father had been using a famous writer's headstone to represent his wife's burial. The story he told Homer was entirely fabricated. Homer finds Mona in a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. They have not seen each other in 27 years. She does not recognize him immediately because the boy she knew has become the man standing in front of her. When Homer proves who he is, the reunion that follows is one of the most genuinely moving scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and his mother, separated by more than 2 decades, finding each other at a grave that belongs to neither of them. Then Mona tells him why. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who would later employ Homer for his entire adult career had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was living an ordinary life in Springfield, married to Abe, mother to a young Homer. Unremarkable in the ways that most lives appear unremarkable from the outside. And then the world that had been burning outside her window found its way in. The civil rights movement, the counterculture, the protests against the Vietnam War. Mona encountered the moral weight of what was happening, and it changed something in her. She joined a group of activists. The show depicts them with characteristic comic exaggeration but makes clear that their cause was legitimate. They had identified a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns, a germ warfare facility in Springfield, in the same community where Homer was growing up and children were playing in the streets, and families were living their lives without any idea that the wealthiest man in town was developing weaponized pathogens in a building down the road. Mona and her group broke into the facility. They detonated what the episode describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. During the raid, in a moment of incidental comedy that the episode treats as genuinely consequential, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The mission succeeded. The biological weapons were destroyed, but Mona made one mistake. As the group fled the facility, Mona stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos, a figure on the ground who needed a moment of help. She paused to assist them, and the person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She extended basic human compassion to the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. He looked up at her. He saw her face. He remembered it. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a federal fugitive who could not go home, could not contact her family, could not hold her son or explain to him why she was gone. She kissed Homer while he was sleeping and walked out of his life for 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was not there. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades believing he was a boy whose mother had chosen to leave him, constructing a personality around the wound of that belief, becoming the man he became at least partly as a result of that foundational absence. Now here is where the conspiracy takes shape. Burns did not simply identify Mona to the authorities and then move on. He held a personal grudge for decades. He had the resources and the infrastructure to maintain that grudge indefinitely, and he used them. When Mona eventually returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through a window and contacts the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time in his life, this time while fully understanding who she is and why she has to go. And this time, Homer also knows who is responsible. The man who destroyed his family. The man who pursued his mother across decades because she destroyed weapons he was manufacturing. The man whose name is on the building where Homer has worked every day of his adult life. Homer does not connect the dots in any lasting or actionable way. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not appear to fully internalize the relationship between the man who signs his paycheck and the man who stole his mother. Homer's inability to make and hold this connection is not played as comedy. It is played as something much quieter and more devastating. Because Homer Simpson is genuinely not capable of the kind of sustained analytical thinking that would allow him to see the full architecture of what has been done to him. The crayon, the radiation, the decades of cognitive erosion from living in Springfield's contaminated environment. Homer is too damaged to see the structure of his own suffering clearly enough to respond to it. And that is the conspiracy the show has embedded across 36 seasons without ever fully naming it outright. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a young child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up with a particular kind of psychological damage. The desperate need for approval. The terror of abandonment. The incapacity to challenge authority even when that authority is actively harming him. The willingness to accept poor treatment from powerful people, because the alternative, losing his position, losing his stability, being alone in the way he was alone as a child without his mother, feels worse than any amount of degradation. Homer does not work at the power plant because he is too limited to find better work, though the show has sometimes used that as a surface explanation. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him before he had the chance to become anything other than what Burns needed him to be. The broken version of Homer, the compliant version, the version who will absorb years of being forgotten and disregarded by his employer without ever mounting a serious challenge to the arrangement, is exactly the kind of worker that a facility operating the way Burns's plant operates requires in the safety inspector role. The show confirms the depth of this arrangement in a later revelation. Burns had committed a crime that Grandpa Simpson discovered. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have permanent employment at the plant, regardless of his performance, regardless of how many errors he made, regardless of how many times he should logically have been fired. 742 documented errors. Homer has never been permanently let go because the deal Abe made with Burns protected his position contractually through an agreement brokered in silence and never explained to Homer, because explaining it would require explaining everything else. It would require Homer to understand who Burns is in relation to his family's full history, and that understanding would be devastating in ways that serve neither Burns nor Abe. So, the deal sits undisclosed. Homer goes to work every day. Burns continues not remembering his name. The radiation keeps leaking. The treatments keep coming. And the man who destroyed one generation of the Simpson family continues to employ the damaged result of that destruction in a position whose primary qualification is that the person filling it lacks the cognitive capacity to notice what the facility is doing. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken by one man's grudge and one town's incapacity to hold power accountable. Mona eventually died in a later season. Her death scene is one of the show's most quietly devastating moments, handled without the comedy that usually cushions the show's emotional weight. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches his mother, the woman he barely knew and lost twice, slip away from him for the last time. There is no joke. There is no cutaway. There is no reset. Just a man and his mother, and the full gravity of 27 years they did not have together, pressing down on the room. The Simpsons is presented as a comedy, It has always been presented as a comedy, and it is frequently genuinely funny in ways that make the laughter feel unearned in retrospect when you look at the full picture underneath the jokes. Under the surface of the gags and the cutaways and Homer falling down and getting back up, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's capacity to exercise power without accountability, across generations, in ways that left each member of the family shaped by damage they did not fully understand and could not fully see. Mona fought back and lost everything she loved. Abe made the deal that he felt he had to make and buried the truth so deep that even Homer never found it on his own. Homer inherited the consequences without inheriting the understanding, became the man he became in the shape defined by the absence that Burns created, and spent his adult life working for the author of his own diminishment without ever quite managing to see the whole picture clearly. Burns won every part of this. He always wins. Because in Springfield, the person with the most money writes the rules, manages the enforcement, and decides what counts as a consequence. And Homer was working in Sector 7G before he was old enough to understand why his life felt like something was always slightly, persistently, fundamentally missing from the center of it. The night is quiet now. The dark is comfortable. This section is a gentler mystery than some of the ones we have been through, but it is one that has been frustrating viewers for longer than most of Springfield's other mysteries, and the explanation for why it has never been resolved is stranger than most people expect. Where is Springfield? Not which state is it in exactly, though that is the version of the question most people ask. The deeper question is why the show has spent 36 years making that question unanswerable, and what the unanswerability of it actually means when you press on it. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people worldwide could identify Springfield as the home of the Simpsons than could identify the capital city of a substantial number of actual American states. The town has a nuclear power plant, a tire yard, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school, a prison, multiple medical facilities, and a corner store that has become one of the most recognized fictional retail locations in global pop culture. Springfield has mountains and ocean access and desert terrain and farmland and forests, all apparently within convenient driving distance of each other. It borders the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching in which season. It is simultaneously coastal and landlocked, northern and southern, rural and suburban and industrial. Its weather ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within the span of a single television season. Springfield does not exist in any one American state because Springfield exists, in some meaningful sense, in all of them at the same time. The show has been actively contradicting itself about Springfield's location since its earliest seasons. Every time a clue appears in an episode that seems to narrow down the geographic possibilities, another clue appears in a different episode that cancels out the first one entirely. One episode places Springfield in the north, another places it in the south. A phone area code suggests Missouri. A state abbreviation shown on screen is one that does not exist. When Homer calls the state capital in one episode, the voice on the other end identifies the state as one whose name begins with a vowel, which reduces the field without resolving it. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the mystery directly in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He stated plainly that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, and that he chose the name partly because it is one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in dozens of states. The name was chosen specifically because it could belong anywhere. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Interview conducted. Creator on record. Case closed. And then the show simply continued placing Springfield in geographic contexts that were inconsistent with Oregon, in episodes produced and aired after the interview. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. The mystery was kept alive, because as has become clear over 36 years, the mystery itself is the point, and allowing it to be resolved would cost more than any revelation could offer. Springfield's geographic impossibility is not a production oversight or a symptom of inconsistent writing across dozens of different showrunners and writing staffs. It is a deliberate and maintained design choice that serves the show's purpose in ways that having a fixed location never could. Springfield has the industrial decay of the Rust Belt and the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt and the small-town insularity of New England and the cultural blankness of the Midwest. It is everywhere and nowhere. It is the town you grew up in, regardless of where you actually grew up, because it was built to contain recognizable pieces of everywhere rather than the specific features of somewhere. That is the surface-level explanation, and it is accurate as far as it goes. Groening and the show's producers have confirmed it explicitly. The design philosophy was always to build a setting that could resonate with the broadest possible American audience by being placed in a location no one could definitively claim as theirs or exclude from their own experience. But the theories we have been working through tonight suggest another dimension to the geographic mystery, one that the surface-level explanation does not address. If the radiation theory is correct, if Springfield is a contamination zone where the laws of biology have been warped by decades of nuclear exposure from a severely compromised facility, why should the laws of geography apply normally to the surrounding landscape? The characters' bodies do not obey normal human biological constraints. The town's social structures do not operate by normal civic logic. The passage of time does not follow normal rules within the community's experience. If everything else about Springfield operates according to a physics that is slightly but consistently wrong, perhaps the geography is the same. Perhaps Springfield has mountains and ocean access and desert terrain all in proximity because the contamination from the plant has not only affected the biology of the residents and the wildlife, perhaps it has done something to the physical landscape itself, compressing or warping geographic features that should be separated by hundreds of miles into a single region that should not exist in its current form but does anyway, because the rules that apply in the rest of the country do not quite apply in Springfield. The coma theory offers a more emotionally coherent version of the same idea. Homer's dreaming mind does not have a precise, accurate map of American geography in its memory. It has impressions. It has emotional associations. It has fragments of landscapes encountered throughout a life, mountains seen on a family vacation, ocean glimpsed in a childhood television program, farmland visible from a car window on a long drive, the particular quality of a Midwestern November afternoon. Homer's unconscious mind built Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, laying them on top of each other without regard for whether they should geographically coexist, because dreams do not organize space the way waking consciousness does. Dreams organize space according to emotional logic. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's fragmented, affectionate, incomplete memory of America, held together by longing rather than cartography. And the principle and the pauper theory provides perhaps the most practically interesting explanation of all. If Springfield operates through the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, if the town's social mechanism is built around collective denial and the managed forgetting of things that cannot be acknowledged without creating problems that are too expensive to solve, then Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not merely a comic device. It is a structural protection. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find on a consistent map. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear facility if the state it operates in keeps changing depending on the source you consult. You cannot establish consistent regulatory oversight for an environmental hazard if the jurisdiction responsible for that oversight is perpetually undefined. Springfield floats between states because floating is legally safer than landing. Landing means committing to a specific regulatory authority. Landing means a specific EPA regional office with consistent jurisdiction. Landing means a specific state attorney general who has clear standing to investigate what is happening to the fish in the river near the plant. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not a comedy convention. It is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed accountability structure, and that arrangement benefits exactly one entity in Springfield more than any other. In the episode Behind the Laughter, the show's 12th season produced a mockumentary episode examining the Simpson family as though they were real people. The episode stated Springfield's location, or rather, it stated two different locations, one in the original broadcast and a different one in syndicated reruns. The answer literally changed depending on which version of the episode you happened to see. Even in the episode where Springfield finally had a definitive answer, the answer was not actually definitive. It shifted. It mutated. It refused to stay pinned down even after it had been stated on screen. Every state in the Union has at some point been theorized as Springfield's home. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence that contradicts it. Every clue has a counterclue. The show has manufactured permanent ambiguity over 36 years and maintained it so consistently that the ambiguity itself has become a defining feature of Springfield's identity. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided long ago that being everywhere is more valuable than being somewhere. A town that belongs to everyone has a cultural reach that a town belonging to any specific somewhere could never achieve. Springfield is yours, wherever you are watching from, because it was built to contain enough of every American place that no viewer could entirely exclude themselves from its geography. The mystery of Springfield's location is the show's most successful long-running joke. The punchline is that there is no answer, and there never will be, because the absence of the answer is the point. And Springfield, in keeping with everything else about it, will protect that absence for as long as the show runs. Which, given the floating timeline and the loops and the resets, and the inability of anyone inside the show to fully see what is happening to them, may be for quite some time yet. We are near the end now. The room is very quiet. The night has done most of its work. This last section is the one that brings everything else together and asks from the gentlest possible angle what all of it actually means. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now, as you read or listen to this. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s when the show began, and they remain in their mid-30s across every episode produced since. Maggie was 1, she is still 1. 36 years have passed in the actual world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When an episode aired in 1995, they were living in 1995. The cultural references update. The technology depicted changes. The background details shift with the times. But the characters themselves remain suspended at the ages they were when the show first introduced them, locked in a permanent present tense that moves with the calendar but never moves with them. This is standard practice for long-running animated shows. Family Guy does it, Futurama did it. Most television cartoons designed for indefinite continuation adopt some version of this convention because the alternative, allowing characters to age in real time, would eventually require the show to become something entirely different from what it began as. Most viewers accept the floating timeline without thinking about it very much, because the convention is so widespread that it registers as part of what animated television simply is. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so profound that they have begun to crack the foundation of the show's own internal reality in ways that shorter-running series never encounter. The clearest version of the problem is the backstory. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was anchored to the late 1970s and early 80s. They met in high school. They fell in love during a specific era, complete with era-appropriate cultural references. Homer's hair and Marge's wardrobe, and the music playing in the background of their courtship scenes all place their formative years in a recognizable historical moment that made sense for parents in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. As the floating timeline dragged the show's present forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they cannot have met in 1980. They would have met in approximately 2005, which means their teenage years were defined not by disco and Watergate, but by early social media and the first generation of smartphones. The show has addressed this, necessarily, by rewriting their origin story across multiple flashback episodes. Each new version places their formative years in a different decade. They were products of the late 70s, then the early 90s, then the late 90s, then the early 2000s. The love story is the same in each version. The characters are essentially the same. But the era keeps sliding forward to maintain the mathematical plausibility of the present moment. This means Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have an approximation of a past, a background that is revised periodically to accommodate the demands of the floating present. Their memories are effectively unstable. Their origin story is a draft that has been rewritten multiple times, and will be rewritten again whenever the timeline requires it. The show treats this as normal, because within the logic of the floating timeline, it is normal. Characters in this framework do not have histories. They have whatever backstory the current episode requires. Every theory we have worked through tonight arrives, through its own particular path, at the same conclusion about this. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went unconscious in the spring of 1993 and has not found his way back since. The dream cannot show his children aging because he was not present to see it happen. The mind can only reconstruct from memory, and his memory of his family is fixed at the moment he lost them. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the population's biology has been altered by decades of chronic nuclear contamination in ways that have modified their cellular aging processes. Whatever the plant has done to the bodies of Springfield's residents, it has done something to the mechanism that normally moves a biological system from one developmental stage to the next. The principle and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield collectively decides not to acknowledge the passage of time, the same way it decides not to acknowledge anything else that threatens the stability of the story it tells about itself. Time passing is inconvenient. Aging characters would require the show to become something different, and Springfield has demonstrated clearly that it will vote, if necessary, to make inconvenient truths illegal rather than accommodate them. The Burns immortality theory establishes that at least one person in Springfield has successfully decoupled biological aging from the ordinary passage of time through the application of extreme wealth and advanced medical technology. If aging is negotiable for Burns, the concept of aging itself is already flexible within this universe, and the population's failure to age in the way the real world demands of its inhabitants is simply the most widely distributed version of what Burns has achieved privately for himself. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done this in full, beautiful detail, more than once. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show flashes forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to be married. The future it depicts is rich and specific and emotionally resonant. Lisa has grown up. She has become the person the show has always been quietly building toward, intellectually formidable, ethically serious, searching for connection in a world that does not entirely understand how to accommodate her. The episode proves beyond any question that the show is capable of imagining its characters as fully realized adults. It can envision their futures with warmth and specificity. And then the episode ends. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. Bart returns to being 10. The glimpse closes. The permanent present resumes as if the vision of the future never occurred. The show can imagine growth. It declines to allow it. And this decision, the decision to keep the Simpson family frozen forever at the ages they were when we first met them, is not only a narrative convenience. It is a statement about why we watch. The Simpsons has been the American family in popular culture for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie have been representing something about American domestic life, American middle-class aspiration and failure and resilience and love, across a period that has encompassed enormous change in what American families actually look like and experience. They have remained constant across all of it. The same house, the same faces, the same dynamics, the same Sunday evening. Homer must always be a middle-aged father figuring out how to be a better one. Marge must always be the emotional load-bearing wall of a family that leans on her more heavily than it fully acknowledges. Bart must always be the kid who is more than he appears and less manageable than anyone would prefer. Lisa must always be the idealist in a world built for pragmatists. Maggie must always be watching, processing, waiting, the moment any of them meaningfully ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves away and Maggie speaks her second word and Homer retires and Marge is left in a house that is finally quiet. The show becomes something different. It becomes an ending. And an ending means acknowledging that the thing is over, which means acknowledging that 36 years have passed, that we are older than we were when we met them, that the couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits for the first time is in a different house now, or in a landfill, or just gone in the way that childhood furniture goes. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a comfort mechanism. It is the show's way of keeping the door to Evergreen Terrace always open, always lit from inside, always available for return. As long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the front door at 5:30 after another day at the plant, we can go back. Any Sunday evening, any channel, any decade. The family is still there, unchanged, exactly as we left them. We did not freeze them in time. They were always going to age. In any universe where cause and effect applies normally, we froze them. We made them constant because we needed something to be constant. We needed the American family to be indestructible, when everything else around us was demonstrably not. We pressed pause in 1989 and we have been pressing it again every week since. Each episode, a small act of preservation. Each season renewed a quiet insistence that some things do not have to end. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week or stream the old episodes at midnight or fall asleep to the familiar voices describing the familiar problems in the familiar house on the familiar street. We do it because the alternative, letting them go, letting them grow old and move on and become something we do not recognize anymore, requires us to acknowledge things about time and change that we would rather leave alone until we have to face them. Every theory in this entire exploration, the radiation, the coma, the who shot Burns mystery, the immortality, the collective denial, the silent genius, the predictions, the hidden conspiracy, the geographic impossibility, they are all different angles on the same central question. What is happening in Springfield that keeps it frozen in place while everything around it changes? The answer the show has been giving us for 36 years, never directly, always in fragments, is that we are what is happening. The audience is the mechanism. Our attention is the energy source. Our unwillingness to let the story end is what keeps the loop running. Every theory explains Springfield from inside the show. The floating timeline explains Springfield from the outside, from the position of the people watching it. We stop time in Springfield because Springfield is the last place we know of where time reliably stopped the way we wanted it to, where the beer is always cold and the kids are always young and the family is always intact and the house on Evergreen Terrace always has its lights on. That is The Simpsons. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, the longest-running animated series in American history, the most analyzed, most theorized, most examined show ever produced. And after all the theories and all the evidence and all the hours spent exploring what lies underneath the surface of the jokes, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can we not let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is every town we have ever lived in, assembled from everything familiar about every place we have ever been. Maybe because Homer is the father in all his fumbling and his love and his stubborn refusal to give up. Maybe because Marge is the patience that holds everything together when nothing else will. Maybe because Bart is who we wanted to be at 10 years old, before the world got complicated. And Lisa is who we were told we should be, before we discovered how hard it is to sustain idealism across decades in a world that does not particularly reward it. And Maggie is the version of ourselves we keep quietly inside, watching everything, saying very little, waiting for the moment when what we are capable of will actually matter. Or maybe it is simpler even than that. Maybe we cannot let them go because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older now, that the world has changed in the ways that the world changes, slowly and then all at once, in ways that leave you looking around one day at the things you thought were permanent and finding that almost none of them are still where you left them. And as long as The Simpsons is still running, as long as the loop keeps floating and the family stays young, and the house on Evergreen Terrace keeps its lights on, we do not have to admit any of that quite yet. We can sit down, turn on the television, go back to Springfield, back to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. And maybe that is enough. For tonight, that is enough. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Production notes for 11 Labs. Pacing. Slow and deliberate throughout, with natural pauses after major revelations. Tone. Warm, curious, unhurried storytelling closer to a late-night documentary than a true crime podcast. Breathing. Natural pauses between paragraphs, longer pauses between sections. Emphasis. Light. This script is designed to be soothing, not dramatic. Numbers. All written out in full words as marked throughout the script. Avoid heavy stress on any single word. Let the sentences carry their own weight. Volume. Consistent and slightly quieter than standard narration. Section transitions. A longer, natural pause of 2 to 3 seconds between sections. Maggie's relationship with the other babies in Springfield deserves attention as part of the larger picture of what she is and what she represents. Gerald, the baby with the single connected eyebrow who appears as Maggie's recurring adversary in multiple episodes, provides an interesting point of comparison. Gerald is presented as Maggie's opposite in disposition, aggressive where she is measured, destructive where she is protective. The rivalry between them appears in contexts that extend well beyond the kinds of interactions normal infants have. It requires both of them to possess a level of sustained awareness and intention that normal infant psychology does not produce. The fact that Gerald has the same kind of extended and purposeful awareness that Maggie does, and that other infants in Springfield's daycare facilities appear to possess capabilities that exceed normal infant development, suggests something interesting. If Maggie's exceptional cognition is the result of radiation exposure producing a mutation that amplified her intelligence, and if the same contaminated environment affects all infants in Springfield, then Maggie may not be the only extraordinary baby in the town. She may simply be the most strategically sophisticated in how she manages what she is. Gerald's aggression suggests he has similar raw capability deployed without Maggie's discretion. The Einstein School for Tots, with its authoritarian administration and its sorting of babies by apparent intelligence, implies that the facility is managing a population of infants who are not behaving the way infants are supposed to behave. An administration that rigidly regulates and categorizes infants may be an administration that has encountered the need to manage children who are more capable than their age suggests they should be. If the contamination theory is producing enhanced cognition in some Springfield infants, the daycare facility may be functioning as a management system for that enhanced cognition rather than simply as childcare. The authoritarian administration that Maggie rebels against in the longest daycare may be designed to contain and suppress rather than to develop and support, which would explain why the facility's response to Maggie's behavior is control rather than curiosity. Maggie's first word, "Daddy," was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in the episode where Homer briefly attempted to quit the power plant job. The context is important. Homer is on the verge of leaving his employment at the facility. He is considering, for perhaps the first time in his career, actually walking away from the arrangement that has defined his entire adult life. And in that moment, Maggie speaks. She says, "Daddy," and the sound of her voice, the first time she has ever used it, is what causes Homer to stay. Whether intentional or not, this is a remarkable convergence. The one time Maggie chooses to break her silence, the one time in the show's canon that she deploys her voice, it is in service of keeping her father in the arrangement that Burns constructed for the Simpson family. She speaks to preserve the status quo. Then she returns to silence and does not speak again. You can read this as pure emotional coincidence. A baby who happens to say her first word at a dramatically convenient moment for the first time and then finds that the word has done what she needed it to do. Or you can read it the way the silence theory would read it. Maggie assessed the situation. She understood what was at stake and what outcome she wanted. She made the decision to use her voice for the one specific intervention that would produce the result she needed. And then she returned to the silence that serves her broader strategic purpose. Because if she speaks, she becomes visible. If she becomes visible, the protection of invisibility is lost. So she speaks once, accomplishes her goal, and retreats back to the position that serves her better. A single word. An entire outcome managed. Then silence restored. Lisa's jealousy of Maggie is never depicted directly in the show, but the dynamic is worth considering. Lisa is 8 years old and she is aware that she is exceptional. She has been told this explicitly by teachers and by her test results and by her own ability to perceive the gap between her cognitive capacity and the people around her. And she has experienced the consequences of that exceptionalism. The isolation, the dismissal, the consistent frustration of being the smartest person in a room that does not particularly value intelligence. Lisa is aware enough to recognize that Maggie is unusual. The show gives her moments of perception about her younger sister that imply she has noticed things about Maggie that the rest of the family has not. But Lisa has never made the argument, within the show's canon, that Maggie is extraordinary in the way she actually is. Perhaps because making that argument would require acknowledging that Maggie has figured out something that Lisa has not. That silence and invisibility and strategic restraint are more powerful tools in Springfield's environment than the visible deployment of exceptional intelligence. Lisa is fighting the right war with the wrong weapons. Maggie is watching her fight it and learning from the losses. The cultural feedback loop between the show and American society deserves more examination than the viral prediction clips usually prompt. When The Simpsons debuted in 1989, it was satirizing a version of American life that already existed. The working-class family struggling with economic pressure, the incompetent employer, the corrupt local politician, the church that provides community without requiring much genuine moral accountability, the school system that warehouses children rather than educating them, the healthcare that is adequate in emergencies and absent in prevention. These were real conditions that the show observed and exaggerated into comedy. As the show ran through the 1990s and into the 2000s and beyond, its relationship with American culture changed. The show did not stop observing American life. But American life started being shaped in small ways by having been inside this particular mirror for so long. Comedy is not a neutral act. It does not simply describe the world. It shapes the world's self-perception. When you make something funny, you change how people relate to it. You change what emotional register they bring to it. You change whether they feel the appropriate alarm or whether they feel the comfortable distance of recognition. The Simpsons made a lot of things funny that were not funny. Burns's corrupting influence over Springfield, the contaminated water, the regulatory failures, the billionaire who literally blocks out the sun and faces no lasting consequences, these are not actually comic situations. They are descriptions of serious conditions, but the show's presentation of them within a comedic framework has contributed to a cultural tendency to process similar situations in the real world through the same lens of amused recognition rather than genuine alarm. When we see a real-world billionaire exercise disproportionate influence over a community's politics and infrastructure, there is a part of the cultural imagination that reaches for the Burns reference. The recognition produces a kind of comfort. We already knew this was possible. The Simpsons showed us. And that recognition, that sense of having anticipated the situation, reduces the emotional urgency that might otherwise drive a response. The show has been teaching us how to laugh at our circumstances rather than how to change them. This is not a criticism of the show. Comedy has always done this. But when you are talking about a show that has been the dominant satirical lens through which American middle-class life has been refracted for 36 years, the cumulative effect of that lesson is worth considering. America has learned to find its Burnses recognizable rather than shocking, to find its Homers sympathetic rather than alarming, to find its Springfields familiar rather than troubling. The show has made these things feel like the furniture of ordinary life, like the way things are, like the background against which everything else happens rather than the foreground requiring attention. Whether the predictions are real or not in any supernatural sense almost does not matter. The predictions feel real because the show has been making certain futures feel inevitable for so long that when they arrive we experience them as already familiar, already incorporated into our understanding of how things tend to go. And that sense of inevitability, that sense of having always known this was coming, is one of the most powerful forces working against the impulse to actually do anything about the conditions being described. Springfield told us Burns would block out the sun. And when the real-world equivalents of Burns did their versions of blocking out the sun, the cultural reflex was recognition rather than action. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us this was what happened. The most unsettling possible reading of the prediction phenomenon is not that the show has access to the future. It is that the show has been preparing us to accept the future by making it feel pre-written, by making it feel like a punchline we were always building toward rather than a catastrophe we might have avoided. The full significance of Burns's biological weapons laboratory and what its existence means for Springfield's history is something the show introduces and then largely leaves for the viewer to carry forward. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant. He was manufacturing biological weapons. He had a germ warfare facility operating in Springfield while Homer was a child, while the families of Springfield were going about their ordinary lives. The facility was eventually destroyed by Mona's raid, but the fact that it existed tells you something important about the scope of Burns's willingness to subject Springfield's population to danger for his own purposes. A billionaire who is willing to manufacture weaponized pathogens in a residential community for profit or strategic purpose is a billionaire who has made a specific calculation about the value of the people living in that community, relative to his own interests. The calculation is not a close one. Burns chose to locate the germ warfare facility in Springfield. He could have located it elsewhere. He chose to take the risk of a biological agent release in a populated community rather than the alternative, which presumably would have involved more logistical complexity and expense. When the facility was destroyed, when Mona and her group deployed their antibiotic bomb and rendered the biological agents inside it inert, Burns's response was to pursue the people responsible with the full force of his resources and connections for decades. He reported Mona to the FBI. He maintained active pursuit of her for 27 years. He spotted her through a window when she returned to Springfield and immediately contacted the authorities. The pursuit was not proportionate. People who destroy biological weapons laboratories are generally not pursued for decades by the owners of those laboratories through informal channels. The standard legal response to the destruction of private property, even property as significant as a weapons facility, does not typically involve the owner dedicating decades of personal resources to tracking down and neutralizing the people responsible. Burns's pursuit of Mona across decades was personal in a way that legal consequences alone do not explain. She had not merely damaged his property. She had, with her specific decision to stop and help him after the raid, made him look her in the face. She had given him her face as something he could not unknow, and she had cost him something more than a facility. She had embarrassed him. She had disrupted his plan. She had, for a brief moment, placed herself in a position to know what he was doing and to judge it. And Burns cannot tolerate the existence of someone who knows what he is doing and has made a judgment about it. The biological weapons facility also puts the nuclear power plant in a different context. Burns did not stumble into the nuclear industry through ordinary business development. He has a documented history of involvement with weapons technology, with the development of capabilities designed to cause mass harm, in the same community where his nuclear plant now operates. The nuclear plant and the biological weapons facility are not two separate chapters of Burns's business history. They are two expressions of the same underlying orientation, which is the willingness to subject Springfield's population to significant danger as an acceptable cost of whatever Burns's current project happens to require. Homer's employment at the plant, viewed through this lens, is not simply the result of an economic deal struck between Burns and Grandpa Simpson. It is Burns continuing the pattern the biological weapons facility represents. Springfield's population, including the Simpsons, continues to function as a resource to be managed and exploited rather than as a community whose welfare places limits on Burns's activities. Homer is in Sector 7G for the same reason the biological weapons lab was in Springfield. Burns's calculus has not changed. Only the specific application has. The geographic ambiguity of Springfield produces a specific and interesting effect on the show's relationship with political satire. Because Springfield has no fixed location, the political institutions it depicts, the mayor's office, the police department, the school board, the local utilities commission, exist in a similar state of geographic suspension. They are the political institutions of everywhere, America. They make the same decisions and display the same patterns of behavior, regardless of which party or which political tradition they are supposed to represent. The mayor of Springfield, Diamond Joe Quimby, is a corruption figure whose specific political affiliation is left deliberately vague. His corruption is bipartisan in its structure, which is to say it is not ideological at all. It is simply the behavior of a person in a position of power who has decided that the position exists primarily for his benefit. The political satire the show conducts around Quimby and the Springfield political class is effective precisely because it does not align with either party. It describes corruption as a feature of power itself rather than as a feature of any particular political tradition. And because Springfield could be anywhere, this description has been available to viewers across the political spectrum to apply to their own local conditions, regardless of which party controlled those conditions. This universality of application is part of what has made the show's satire durable across decades of enormous political change. The patterns of behavior it describes in Springfield's power structure, the insulation of the wealthy from accountability, the tendency of institutions to serve the interests of the most powerful actors in their environment, the capacity of communities to collectively ignore things they cannot afford to confront, all of these patterns are present across different political contexts and different local conditions throughout America. Springfield's geographic impossibility is what allows the show to function as a mirror that anyone can hold up to their own specific location. If Springfield were in Ohio, it would be a critique of Ohio. But because Springfield is everywhere, it is a critique of everywhere. And a critique of everywhere is simultaneously a critique of anywhere the viewer happens to be. The jurisdictional ambiguity the geographic mystery creates also allows the show to address regulatory and legal questions in ways that would be more complicated if Springfield had a specific state. Environmental law, nuclear regulation, labor law, public health requirements, all of these vary significantly across different states. By keeping Springfield's location undefined, the show can depict regulatory failures that would not be uniformly applicable if the story were set in a specific regulatory environment. The violations at the nuclear plant are presented as general regulatory failures rather than failures specific to a particular state's regulatory framework. This makes the critique more broadly applicable, and also makes it harder to counter by pointing to specific state protections that would prevent what the show depicts. Burns benefits from this ambiguity more directly than anyone else in the show. His facility has been depicted as operating in violation of federal standards that apply regardless of state. But the enforcement of those federal standards runs through state regulatory agencies and state law enforcement channels. If Springfield state is undefined, the specific agency responsible for pursuing Burns's violations is also undefined. There is no named state environmental agency with jurisdiction over the plant. There is no named state attorney general with standing to bring charges. There is only the EPA in the Simpsons movie, arriving from the federal level and imposing a dome because the normal regulatory channels apparently failed to produce any other response. Springfield floated between states for decades, and the consequence was that for decades, no consistent regulatory authority could point to the Springfield nuclear power plant and say this is our responsibility to address. The floating timeline, when examined from the perspective of the show's cultural position rather than from inside its fictional universe, reveals something about the relationship between long-running media and the audiences that sustain it. The Simpsons did not intend to run for 36 seasons. No show intends that from the beginning. The show was renewed season by season, year by year, with each renewal representing a specific decision by Fox and by the show's producers that there was sufficient audience demand and sufficient creative material to justify continuation. The floating timeline was adopted early as a practical necessity and then maintained because every attempt to allow the characters to age would have required the show to fundamentally change what it was. But the cumulative effect of 36 years of that decision is something that no one involved in the show's early production could have fully anticipated. The Simpson family has now been frozen at the ages. They were in December of 1989 for longer than many of their viewers have been alive. There are adults who watch the show now who were born after the floating timeline had already been in operation for years. For these viewers, the Simpson family has always been exactly the age they currently are. There is no personal memory of a time when Bart was newly 10 and Lisa was newly 8, and the show was a fresh and somewhat shocking piece of television rather than an established institution. The characters have become something more than fictional family. They have become a reference point for generational identity. People who grew up watching the show in its early seasons carry a specific emotional relationship with it that is bound up with their own childhood memories. The show exists in their memory not just as entertainment, but as a part of the environmental texture of their formative years. Homer's voice, the theme music, the specific look of the couch gag, all of these carry the particular weight of things that were present in childhood. This emotional weight is part of what the floating timeline is protecting. When you ask whether The Simpsons should let its characters age, you are not really asking a creative question about narrative strategy. You are asking whether the show is willing to signal that the era it represents in the audience's memory is genuinely over. And the show has consistently answered that question with no. Not yet. Not quite. The era is not over because we are still here. Every season renewed is a small act of resistance against the passage of time. Every episode that airs is the show insisting that this family, in this configuration, in this house, continues to be possible. Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8. The couch is still there. The opening credits still play. You can still go home. This is, when you think about it clearly, a kind of miracle that the show has managed to sustain. To remain across 36 years of enormous cultural change, the place where the American family still lives in the configuration that television produced it in the late 1980s. The configuration that was specific to a particular economic moment, a particular set of domestic arrangements, a particular vision of what the middle-class American household looked like and what it struggled with. That moment is past in the real world. The economic conditions that the early Simpsons depicted have transformed in ways that make the show's foundational premise increasingly removed from the actual experience of American families. Homer's single income, supporting a house and 3 children in a relatively comfortable working-class lifestyle, is a financial configuration that is significantly harder to sustain in 2025 than it was in 1980. 9. The conditions that produce the Simpsons family are less common now than they were, and yet the family persists, unchanged, on the same street, at the same ages, with the same economic circumstances, somehow continuing to support the same lifestyle despite 3.5 decades of economic change that should have disrupted it entirely. The floating timeline maintains not just the characters but the economic myth the show built its premise on. The fantasy of the comfortable working-class life, the single-income family with a house and a yard and a dog, and children who stay young. The show keeps this fantasy alive even as the conditions that would make it real have become increasingly unavailable to the actual working-class Americans it is supposed to represent. Which is perhaps the deepest mystery of the floating timeline. It is not just the characters who have not aged. It is the dream of a particular American life that the show was built to represent. The dream has been frozen along with the characters, and every week the show airs, it insists that the dream is still possible, still ongoing, still available to the family on Evergreen Terrace, even if it has become significantly less available to the families watching them. We cannot let them go because we cannot quite let the dream go. The Simpsons gave the dream a house and a street and a family and a name. And as long as the show runs, the dream continues. As long as the dream continues, the characters cannot age. Because aging the characters means aging the dream. And aging the dream means admitting it might be more nostalgic than realistic, more memory than possibility. Bart is 10. Lisa is 8. Homer is coming home from work. The lights are on in the house on Evergreen Terrace. And the dream is still running. Right where we left it in December of 1989. Sleep gently. The dream will still be there when you wake up. That was always the point. That was always the whole, beautiful, melancholy, endlessly forgiving point. Before we go any further into Springfield, take a moment with the specific strangeness of what we are doing here. We are choosing, voluntarily, to spend several hours in the company of mysteries that have no official answers and characters who have been frozen in time since before most of the people reading or listening to this were born. There is something worth sitting with in that choice. The Simpsons is one of the most analyzed, most theorized, most academically examined pieces of popular culture in the history of the medium. Researchers have written papers about it. Philosophers have used it as a teaching text. Linguists have studied the show's coinages and their entry into everyday speech. Economists have used Springfield as a case study. The show has been examined from more angles and with more seriousness than perhaps any other entertainment product of the last half-century. And yet the basic mysteries at the heart of the show remain unresolved. Not because nobody has looked carefully enough, but because the show has been constructed in a way that maintains its mysteries even under sustained scrutiny. The questions the show raises, the things it implies and suggests in circles without landing, are not questions that the writers forgot to answer. They are questions the writers answered in the negative, over and over, by never producing a resolution that closed them. Every theory about Springfield exists because the show created the conditions for that theory and then declined to provide the refutation. That relationship between the show and its mysteries is worth thinking about before we go in. The Simpsons is not a show with plot holes. It is a show with deliberate gaps. And the deliberate gaps are more interesting than any answer could be, because they keep the conversation alive. They keep people coming back, not just to watch the new episodes, but to return to the old ones, looking for evidence they missed, connections they did not notice, patterns that only become visible when you look at 36 seasons as a unified whole rather than as individual half-hour stories. We are going to look at it as a whole tonight. We are going to follow the threads wherever they lead. There is a specific episode that illuminates the Homer and Plant relationship more fully than almost any other. Homer versus Patty and Selma covers some of it. Homer the vigilante touches on it. But the episode that sits at the center of understanding Homer's relationship with the reactor is the one in which Homer is directly exposed to a concentrated burst of radiation, and the show depicts what happens to his body in the aftermath. Across multiple episodes, Homer comes into contact with the core in ways that should produce immediately visible and catastrophic radiation sickness. The show treats these moments as comedy. Homer is briefly glowing or briefly affected and then returns to normal by the following scene. But what the show is actually depicting, if you apply real-world radiation biology to what is happening on screen, is repeated acute exposure events layered on top of whatever chronic baseline exposure Homer has been absorbing through his daily proximity to the facility for his entire career. Radiation biology distinguishes between chronic exposure, which is ongoing low-level exposure over extended periods, and acute exposure, which is concentrated exposure over a short period. Both produce biological effects, but of different kinds and through different mechanisms. Homer's situation combines both. He has the chronic baseline from decades of working near the reactor, and he has the acute episodes from the various direct contact events the show depicts. The combination of chronic and acute exposure, in a real-world context, would produce an acceleration of the biological effects that either type would produce on its own. Homer's extraordinary regenerative capacity, his ability to recover from injuries that should be permanent, begins to make more sense under this framework if you think of his body as having adapted to radiation exposure over decades in the way that organisms sometimes adapt to chronic environmental stressors. Biological adaptation to radiation does occur in nature. Populations of organisms living in contaminated environments over multiple generations sometimes show measurable changes in radiation sensitivity. Homer has not had multiple generations, but he has had decades. And whatever genetic or epigenetic changes have accumulated in his biology over those decades of exposure may have produced the specific pattern the show depicts: extraordinary physical resilience at the cost of significant cognitive function. The mechanism would be something like this. Radiation damage to tissue is repaired by cellular mechanisms that the body deploys in response to that damage. Chronic exposure to low-level radiation means those repair mechanisms are constantly active. Over time, a body subjected to this kind of constant demand on its repair mechanisms might optimize them, developing an accelerated and highly efficient cellular repair capacity that allows for recovery from damage that would be permanent in a less adapted body. The cost of this optimization would be the metabolic resources it consumes, resources that would otherwise be available for other functions, including the maintenance of neurological complexity. Homer's superhuman physical recovery and his dramatically reduced cognitive function are not two separate consequences of two separate conditions. They may be two sides of the same biological adaptation. His body has gotten very, very good at fixing itself. It has gotten so good at this specific task that it has had to reduce investment in other functions to support it. The brain, which is metabolically expensive to maintain at full complexity, is the most logical place for those resources to come from. Homer is indestructible because his body has been optimized for survival in a radiation-contaminated environment, and he is cognitively impaired because the optimization of physical resilience came at the cost of cognitive resources. He is, in the most literal biological sense, an organism that has adapted to its environment, an environment that was created and is maintained by the man who employs him. The specific pattern of narrative deterioration in post-coma seasons follows a timeline that aligns with what neurologists describe as the expected progression of cognitive decline in patients with extended unconscious states. In the first few seasons after the hypothetical April 93 coma, seasons 5 through 7, the show maintains considerable narrative coherence. The plots are more outlandish than the pre-coma material, but they have internal logic. Character motivations are consistent. Cause and effect relationships operate within recognizable parameters. The dream, in these early post-coma seasons, is being generated by a brain that still has access to most of its pre-coma memory and most of its pre-coma cognitive architecture. The reconstruction is imperfect but coherent. In seasons 8 through 12, the deterioration accelerates. The plots become more disconnected from consequence. Characters behave in ways that contradict established personality. The show's internal physics become increasingly flexible. The dream brain is working harder to maintain the simulation and producing results that show the effort. Like a photograph that has been copied too many times, the image is still recognizable, but the resolution is visibly worse. Seasons 13 through 20 represent the phase in which the simulation's coherence becomes noticeably unreliable. Character consistency is frequently abandoned between episodes. Plot logic that the show takes for granted within a single episode often cannot survive examination across episodes. The dream is running, but the underlying model is degrading. By the most recent seasons, the simulation generates stories that would have been impossible within the internal physics of the show's early years. Not just more outlandish, structured differently. The causal logic that earlier seasons maintained even in their most absurd moments is now frequently absent entirely. Events happen. Things follow from them arbitrarily. The resolution of each episode is not earned by the episode's internal logic, it simply occurs. This pattern matches closely with what neurologists observe in patients who remain in extended states of unconsciousness. The brain does not deteriorate uniformly. It maintains certain functions longer than others. In the early stages, dream generation in unconscious patients can be remarkably coherent, drawing on intact long-term memory to produce elaborate and internally consistent experiences. Over time, As the underlying biological capacity degrades, the coherence of these experiences decreases. They become more fragmented, more non-linear, more willing to generate situations that contradict each other without the dreaming mind registering the contradiction. The Simpsons has been following this curve with remarkable precision across 36 seasons, if the coma theory is correct. Not the curve of creative quality, which is a subjective assessment that different viewers would draw differently. The curve of neurological deterioration, which has a more objective shape. The dream is less coherent now than it was in 1993. It was less coherent in 2003 than it was in 1993. It will be less coherent in the future than it is now. The show will end when the simulation finally cannot maintain itself. When the dreaming brain reaches the point where it can no longer generate a plausible Springfield, no matter how minimally plausible Springfield has always been. When the house on Evergreen Terrace finally stops looking like a house and starts looking like what it is, the coma theory predicts that The Simpsons will not end with a dramatic finale or a deliberately constructed conclusion. It will end with the simulation simply stopping. One week Springfield will be there and the next week it will not. And the man in the hospital bed will either have woken up or stopped needing to dream at all. Until that moment, every episode is both a new entry in the dream and evidence of how far the dream has come from the day the vending machine fell. The question of what happens to Burns's empire when Burns finally dies, if he ever does, is one the show raises repeatedly without answering. Smithers is the obvious candidate for succession. He understands the full operational complexity of the enterprise better than anyone else alive. He manages the treatment schedule that keeps Burns functional. He knows the plant's true condition and has presumably developed some working accommodation with the violations that allows the facility to continue operating. He knows where the bodies are, in the most literal possible sense given the skeletons in the basement. But Smithers has never been positioned as a successor in the show's canon. Burns speaks of Smithers as an indispensable servant rather than as a designated heir, and Smithers' orientation toward Burns is oriented around Burns' continuation rather than around the continuation of the enterprise Burns represents. Smithers wants Burns alive. He may not have a clear picture of what he would do with the Empire if Burns were gone, because the possibility of Burns being gone is not one Smithers has allowed himself to fully conceptualize. This creates an interesting structural vulnerability in Burns's empire. The most elaborate and comprehensive system ever constructed for the continuation of a single individual's existence has, apparently, no succession plan for what happens to the thing being continued when continuation is no longer possible. Burns has spent a century and extraordinary resources building the infrastructure that keeps him alive. He appears to have spent very little of that effort thinking about what the infrastructure is for beyond keeping him specifically alive, which suggests that the Empire is not, in any meaningful sense, designed to outlast Burns. It is designed to delay the moment when outlasting him becomes necessary. Every dollar spent on the treatments, every relationship maintained with physicians and pharmaceutical researchers, every deal struck to protect the plant's operational status, all of it is in service of extending the timeline, not of managing the endpoint. The endpoint, for Burns, appears to be a concept he has refused to fully engage with. If Burns dies, the plant is likely not operational for long without him. The specific informal arrangements that have allowed the facility to continue in its current condition depend on Burns's presence and Burns's money and Burns's relationships with the regulatory and political figures who have been accommodated into the current arrangement. Remove Burns, and those relationships do not automatically transfer. The violations at the plant would become visible to new owners or new managers in ways they have not been visible under Burns's management, precisely because Burns has known where not to look. Springfield's economy is dependent on the plant. The plant is dependent on Burns. If Burns dies, the chain breaks. The town loses its primary employer and its power supply simultaneously. The contamination in the water would remain. The three-eyed fish would still be in the river. The biological changes in the population would persist regardless of what happens to the facility. But the economic engine that has provided the town with the means to continue existing in its current form would be gone. Springfield after Burns might be a very interesting place. A town with a contaminated water supply, a shuttered power plant, a population that has adapted biologically to a specific environmental condition that no longer has a management structure, and no billionaire pulling the strings of its civic institutions. What does Springfield look like when the system that has been running it for decades is removed? The show will never answer this. Burns is still alive and shows no indication of changing that status. But the question is worth sitting with, because it illuminates what Springfield actually is. Not a town that happens to have a nuclear plant. A town that was built around the needs of that plant and the man who owns it. A company town in the old industrial sense. Except instead of coal or steel, the product is power, and the byproduct is a population of people whose bodies have been shaped by their proximity to the thing that their town was built to serve. The show has depicted Maggie speaking on several occasions across its run, with each occasion treated as exceptional and returned to silence in subsequent episodes. Beyond the Elizabeth Taylor cameo for her first word, Maggie has been given voice in dream sequences, in future projections, and in special episodes that exist outside the main continuity. Each time she speaks in these special contexts, the show makes a point of the speaking. It is presented as an event, a departure from the norm, something that the other characters notice and that the audience is meant to notice. The consistency of the show's reluctance to allow Maggie a speaking role in the main continuity across 36 years and many different showrunner regimes and writing staffs suggests that the silence is considered essential rather than incidental. Different writers have come to the show with different priorities and different ideas about which aspects of its established formula can be adjusted. The constraint on Maggie's voice has survived all of them. This consistency implies a production-level understanding that Maggie's silence is foundational to what she is. Not a quirk that different writers have perpetuated out of inertia, but a recognized structural element that serves the show's ongoing purposes in ways that giving her a regular voice would undermine. What those purposes are has two possible answers within the show's internal logic. The first is the theory we have already developed at length, that Maggie's silence is her own strategic choice, a decision made by a sufficiently intelligent mind to preserve the advantage of invisibility in an environment that punishes visible intelligence. If this is correct, Maggie speaks in the special episodes because those episodes exist outside the frame of the main story, and within them the strategic constraint is temporarily lifted because the consequences do not carry over. In dream sequences and future projections, Maggie speaks because in those spaces the normal rules do not apply. The second possible answer is that Maggie's silence represents something the show has never wanted to resolve. The character has been built around a mystery, around the question of what is behind the silence and when it will end, and resolving the mystery by giving Maggie a regular voice would require the show to answer that question permanently. As long as she is silent, the question remains open, the anticipation remains intact. There is something still to come from Maggie that has not arrived yet, and the show has maintained that sense of anticipation for 36 years by consistently declining to deliver on it. Both of these answers are compatible with each other. Maggie's silence serves the show's narrative purposes and the character's strategic purposes simultaneously. The show declines to give her a regular voice, because doing so would resolve a question it wants to keep open. And within the show's fiction, Maggie declines to use her voice because doing so would reveal what she is to an audience she is not ready to reveal herself to. The character and the show are aligned in their preference for the continuing mystery over any specific resolution. And as long as they remain aligned, the silence continues. Maggie watches. The audience waits. And somewhere behind those enormous eyes, something is thinking about the right moment. The Simpsons occupies an unusual position in American cultural history because it has been running long enough to have participated in the formation of multiple distinct generational identities. People who were children in the early 1990s have a relationship with The Simpsons that is bound up with their earliest memories of engaged cultural participation. The show was new and somewhat transgressive when they encountered it. It was doing things that family television had not done before. It was depicting a family that yelled at each other and made bad decisions and faced genuine economic pressure, all of which was new enough in the animated family format to feel revelatory. People who came to the show in the late 90s encountered a different show. The Golden Age seasons that fans lionize, the period from roughly season 3 through season 8 or 9, were already established as a canon of brilliant episodes by the time this generation found them. They came to a show that already had its masterpieces, that was already being discussed in terms of what it had achieved rather than what it was currently doing. Their relationship with the show is a relationship with a body of work rather than with a developing one. People who grew up with the show in the 2000s and beyond encountered it in a period when the critical consensus about the show's decline was already established. They came to The Simpsons already knowing, from cultural context, that the show's best years were behind it. Their relationship with the show is already mediated by this received wisdom, by the awareness that what they are watching is the continuation of something that peaked before they were old enough to watch it. Each of these generational relationships produces a different kind of cultural investment in the show, but all of them share the characteristic that the show exists in their experience, not just as entertainment, but as cultural furniture. It is part of the environment they grew up in. Its references are references everyone around them also has. Its shorthand is shared shorthand. Its characters are not fictional people who exist only in the show. They are cultural figures who have a presence in the broader social environment, regardless of whether any specific person has watched a specific episode. This is what it means for a show to become cultural infrastructure rather than simply popular entertainment. The Simpsons has moved beyond the category of show you watch into the category of cultural presence you exist inside whether you watch it or not. Its references reach people through other people, through memes and merchandise and conversation, in ways that do not require the original source material to be viewed. And this is what makes the prediction phenomenon so persistent, even after the mechanism has been explained. The Simpsons does not just predict specific events, it predicts the emotional register in which those events will be received. When something that the show depicted as satire happens in real life, the cultural reflex is not alarm, it is recognition. We have the emotional frame for it already. The Simpsons gave it to us. And that pre-framing of the response, that conditioning of the emotional register in advance, is the deepest and most lasting effect of the show's cultural presence. The predictions are not prophecies, they are preparations. The show prepares us to receive certain kinds of news with a specific emotional response. And when the news arrives, we reach for the frame we were given, which is not the frame of people who did not see this coming and are trying to figure out how to respond. It is the frame of people who already knew, who had already processed this in the form of a joke, who have been ready for this punchline for years. Whether that is a good thing or a complicated thing depends on what you think the right emotional response to the kinds of events the show has been preparing us for would have been. Abe Simpson's role in the family conspiracy is the part of the Mona story that the show has been most reluctant to fully examine. Abe knew the truth about Mona from the beginning. He was there when she left. He knew she had not died. He chose to tell Homer she was dead. He chose to maintain that lie for the next 3 decades. Across all of Homer's childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, across all the years during which the false belief that his mother was dead shaped Homer's personality into the specific configuration it took. The standard sympathetic reading of Abe's choice is that he was protecting Homer from a painful and confusing truth that a child could not have processed or acted on usefully. The truth was that Homer's mother was alive but could not come home because a powerful man had reported her to the federal government after she destroyed his weapons lab. What does a 5 or 6-year-old child do with that information? Nothing useful. He grieves for a living mother the way he would grieve for a dead one, but with the additional complication of knowing that she is somewhere, that she could theoretically return, that the absence is political rather than absolute. Abe may have concluded that the clean finality of death was kinder to a child than the ongoing ambiguity of living absence. That telling Homer his mother was dead gave him something to grieve and then move past, rather than something to wait for that might never come. There is a coherent version of Abe's decision that reads as motivated by genuine paternal protectiveness. But there is another version. Abe was not just protecting Homer from painful information. He was also protecting himself from a complicated conversation about how and why Mona's situation came to be. He was protecting himself from having to explain his own choices, his own passivity, his own accommodation of a situation in which the man who employed him was simultaneously the man who had destroyed his wife's life and forced her underground. Abe continued working in a community whose dominant employer had just destroyed his family. He did not take Homer and leave Springfield. He did not attempt to publicly expose Burns's role in Mona's situation. He stayed. He worked. He eventually struck a deal with Burns to guarantee Homer's employment in exchange for his silence about a crime. Abe chose accommodation. He chose the practical stability of remaining in Springfield under Burns's economic umbrella over the moral clarity of confronting what Burns had done. And the lie he told Homer about Mona's death was not just protection for Homer. It was cover for Abe's own choices. If Homer grew up believing his mother was dead, Homer would never ask the questions about how and why she died that might eventually lead him to understand the full shape of the arrangement his father had made with the man who destroyed the family. Homer spent his entire adult life working for the man who took his mother away from him in a deal negotiated by his father, without knowing any of this was the structure he was living inside. Every day Homer clocked in at the plant was a day that Abe's silence held the structure in place. Every paycheck Homer received from Burns was a paycheck that existed because Abe had made a deal he never told his son about. And Abe watched this. He watched Homer grow up damaged by the lie. He watched Homer become the man he became, the man of desperate approval-seeking and terror of abandonment and inability to challenge authority. And he watched it while knowing that the damage was at least partly the product of his own choices. Homer's brokenness is not just Burns's doing. It is also Abe's, in the specific way that lying to a child about the most fundamental facts of their family life and then watching that lie shape the child into adulthood is a thing that a parent does to a child. Abe is not a villain in The Simpsons. He is a deeply compromised man who made the choices he felt he needed to make and then had to live with what those choices produced. But the weight of those choices, distributed across 3 generations of Simpsons, is the kind of accumulated damage that does not get repaired just because it is finally named. There is a concept in urban geography called a non-place, a term coined by the anthropologist Marc Augé to describe locations that do not allow the formation of identity, the experience of historical continuity, or genuine human relations. Airports, highway rest stops, shopping malls, spaces that are designed for transit and transaction rather than for dwelling and meaning. Springfield is the opposite of a non-place in its design and function. It is explicitly a place of identity formation, historical accumulation, and human relation. Its citizens have lived there for decades. Its history extends back centuries in some corners of the show's mythology. The relationships that define the characters, their bonds of friendship and enmity and family and civic connection, are all rooted in the specific physical and social geography of Springfield. But Springfield is also, geographically, effectively nowhere. It exists in a state of permanent cartographic suspension, floating between states, borrowing geographical features from everywhere, refusing to be pinned to any specific location in the way that real places are pinned. It is the most elaborately characterized non-place in the history of American fiction. This paradox is part of what makes Springfield such an effective setting for the particular kind of story The Simpsons is telling. The show needs a place that feels fully inhabited, fully real, fully consistent in its internal character and history, while simultaneously being available to every viewer regardless of their actual geographic location. It needs somewhere that is completely specific in its fictional geography and completely general in its cultural resonance. The floating geographical location solves both requirements simultaneously. Springfield is specific enough in its internal logic that the characters have genuine relationships with specific locations within it. The Quick E-Mart, Moe's Tavern, the nuclear plant, Springfield Elementary, these are real places within the show's universe with histories and characteristics that have accumulated across decades of storytelling. But the absence of a fixed external location means that any viewer from any actual American location can overlay their own local geography onto Springfield's general template without the specific details of either conflicting with each other. The show is set in your town and my town and everyone's town simultaneously, not because it is vague, but because it is everywhere. The floating timeline protects something that the show has never explicitly acknowledged protecting. It protects the audience's grief. Every viewer who has returned to The Simpsons in adulthood after a long absence has had the experience of encountering the show at a specific moment of personal change, a loss or a transition, or a significant life event, and finding Springfield unchanged. The house on Evergreen Terrace is still there, the family is still intact, Bart is still 10, Homer is still stumbling home. And that unchangedness, in the context of personal change, produces an emotional response that is more complex than simple nostalgia. Nostalgia is longing for a past that is acknowledged to be gone. What the floating timeline produces is something closer to the feeling of finding a room that has been kept exactly as you left it. A room where time stopped at a specific moment and has not resumed since. A room that is somehow still accessible, still inhabitable, still the way it was when the thing you associate with it was still present in your life. For viewers who encountered The Simpsons in childhood and returned to it in adulthood, Springfield is that room. It is the place where the specific texture of the time when you first watched it is still intact. Because the characters are still exactly the age they were then, the house still looks the same, the problems are still the same domestic ones that felt immediately recognizable when you were young enough to see your own family in them. The show holds open a door that should have closed long ago. It maintains access to a specific emotional and experiential register that would have become inaccessible if the characters had aged along with their audience. Bart at 36 years old is a different relationship than Bart at 10, even if the stories being told about him are equally good. Because Bart at 10 is the version of Bart that exists in the memory of everyone who watched him in 1989, and the show has kept that version of him available for 36 years without any age-related alterations to the access. The floating timeline is grief management technology. It is the show's way of keeping the door open to the past without requiring the audience to acknowledge that the past is what they are returning to. Springfield is not historical. It is present. It is always present. The couch gag plays and the family runs in, and it is happening now, not then. The now is identical to the then, which means the now can contain everything the then contained. Every time someone watches an episode and feels the specific comfort of familiarity, the pleasure of something being exactly where they left it, the relief of a world that is still intact when the world around them is not, the floating timeline is doing its intended work. Not the work the production team consciously designed it to do, because the floating timeline was adopted as a practical storytelling convention rather than as an emotional management tool. But the work it does regardless. The work of keeping the door open, of maintaining the access, of insisting, against the evidence of 3.5 decades of actual time passing, that this particular family is still available, still here, still exactly as you remember them. That insistence is the show's longest-running and most successful act of kindness toward its audience, and it is the thing we cannot let go of. Because letting it go means accepting that the door has closed, that the room has changed, that the past is past in a way that no amount of streaming access can reverse. The Simpsons will end someday. That is a certainty, and when it ends, the floating timeline will land. The present will become past. Springfield will become history rather than a current address, and everyone who has been visiting it as though it were still ongoing will have to acknowledge that it was always, from some perspective, a memory they were returning to rather than a place they were currently inhabiting. Until that day, the timeline floats. Bart is 10. Lisa is 8. The lights are on. And the family is still there, exactly as you left them, right where you left them, waiting for you to come back. As you always do, as you always will, Blinky deserves more attention than the show ever gave him after his initial appearance. A three-eyed fish is not a mystery. It is a measurement. It is a biological data point that carries a specific and unambiguous message about the environment that produced it. Fish do not grow third eyes because of genetics. They do not grow third eyes because of disease in the conventional sense. Three-eyed fish, in the real world, have been found near industrial waste sites, near contaminated water sources, near locations where chemical or radioactive runoff has altered the biological environment sufficiently to produce visible developmental abnormalities. Blinky is not a curiosity. Blinky is an environmental indicator species doing exactly what indicator species do, which is registering and reflecting the conditions of their environment in their own biology. The episode in which Blinky appears treats the discovery of a three-eyed fish as a political problem to be managed, rather than an environmental problem to be addressed. The gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as a campaign issue. Burns is forced to eat the fish on television. The fish becomes a symbol deployed in an argument between two people with competing agendas, neither of whom appears primarily interested in the question the fish is actually answering. That question is simple. If the organisms living downstream from your facility are developing visible anatomical mutations, what is your facility doing to the organisms living around it on land? The answer to that question is what the radiation mutation theory is built on. Blinky is the visible, undeniable, nationally reported piece of evidence that the contamination is real and is producing biological effects in living organisms. And the town of Springfield looked at Blinky, watched Burns eat him, and moved on. No water testing. No independent environmental assessment. No follow-up study of the fish population in the waterways near the plant. No inquiry into whether similar mutations were occurring in the wildlife on land near the facility. Blinky appeared in Season 2. That is 34 years of subsequent seasons during which Blinky's existence and what it implied about Springfield's environment was available as context for every other strange thing the show depicted. The three-eyed fish is still out there. The river that produced him is still downstream from the plant. The plant is still operating with the same cracked cooling infrastructure and the same safety violations and the same inspector who sleeps at his desk. If anything, the conditions that produced Blinky have had another 3 decades to intensify. Whatever the concentration of contaminants was in the river when the first three-eyed fish was caught, that concentration has been accumulating since then. The biological effects of 34 additional years of the same contamination, in the same water, flowing into the same watershed, should be producing mutations that make Blinky look mild. The show never returns to this. The river is shown as a background feature in countless episodes. Fishing trips are depicted. Swimming occurs. Springfield's relationship with its waterways continues as though a fisherman did not once pull a three-eyed fish out of them on national television. Springfield's capacity for collective amnesia is nowhere more clearly demonstrated than in its relationship with its own river. The contamination evidence was public. It was famous. It was nationally reported within the show's own universe. And it produced exactly zero lasting change in the town's relationship with its water, or its power plant, or its most powerful citizen. The people of Springfield did not forget that Blinky existed because they failed to pay attention when he appeared. They forgot because remembering was incompatible with continuing to live the way they were already living. That is the specific mechanism the town relies on. Not ignorance, choice. Within the coma theory, Marge Simpson occupies a position that is distinct from every other character in the dream. The other characters, Homer's children, his friends, his co-workers, his neighbors, all exist in the dream as constructions from Homer's memory and his ambient experience of the hospital environment. They are maintained by his unconscious reconstruction of the people he knew, supplemented by whatever fragments of external information reach him through the fog of unconsciousness. They are real people, filtered through a damaged and deteriorating mind, and the distortions in their characterization across the show's run reflect the distortions introduced by that filter. Marge is different. Across all 36 seasons, and across all the narrative inconsistencies and character drift and plot impossibilities that the coma theory attributes to neurological deterioration, Marge has remained more consistent than any other character. Her core characteristics, her patience, her love for Homer, her tendency to manage the household crisis that Homer creates, her fundamental decency and her fundamental loneliness, all of these have remained recognizable across the entire run in a way that Homer's characterization, for example, has not. Homer has drifted dramatically. His intelligence, his competence, his personality traits, his specific interests and fears and behavioral patterns, all of these have shifted considerably across the seasons in ways that match the coma theory's prediction of a deteriorating simulation. But Marge has stayed more or less herself. The dream has been much more careful with Marge than with anyone else. If Homer is dreaming and his dream is failing to maintain the other characters with consistent fidelity, why is Marge more carefully maintained? The answer the coma theory would give is that Marge is not a construction the way the other characters are. She is an anchor. She is the person Homer is trying most desperately to hold on to. His unconscious mind may be losing its grip on Ned Flanders and Chief Wiggum and the specific details of Bart's character, but it is maintaining Marge with a care that reflects how central she is to the purpose of the dream. Homer is not dreaming of Springfield because he loves Springfield. He is dreaming of Springfield because Springfield is where Marge is. The nuclear plant and the neighbors and the neighborhood and all the rest of it are the scaffolding that supports the central fact of the dream, which is that Marge is there. Marge is patient. Marge loves him. Marge is waiting at home. Every episode in which Homer does something catastrophic and Marge is frustrated but ultimately forgives him is the dream's core emotional statement. The dream is not interested in consequences. It is interested in forgiveness. It is interested in the specific experience of being someone who causes harm and is nonetheless loved, someone who fails and is nonetheless chosen, someone who does not deserve the grace he receives and receives it anyway, over and over, because the person giving it has decided that he is worth the giving. That is the dream Homer cannot wake from, not because it is perfect, because the imperfections are the point. He dreams of Marge frustrated and then Marge forgiving because the forgiveness is what he needs. A Marge who was never frustrated would have nothing to forgive. Homer needs the conflict to need the resolution. He needs the damage to need the repair. He needs to fall so that someone can help him get up. The coma is not Homer's punishment. The coma is Homer's most honest prayer. It is his unconscious mind constructing the closest possible approximation of the life he wants, in the language of the life he already had, and then refusing to let that construction end because ending it means letting Marge go. Marge is more consistent in the dream because she is the dream's reason for existing. Everything else can degrade. The simulation can lose coherence around every other figure in Springfield. But Marge stays recognizable because Marge is who the whole thing is for. The practical question of how the shooting actually occurred deserves more attention than the official verdict invites. Burns was shot outside, after the town meeting. The meeting itself took place inside a public building. The evidence established that Burns's gun was taken from his holster, used to shoot him, and then either dropped at the scene or carried away, depending on which account you credit. The timeline of events matters here. The town meeting concluded. Burns left the building. He encountered someone in the parking lot or in the immediate vicinity of the building. That person somehow obtained his gun, shot him, and departed before anyone arrived on the scene. Burns was discovered lying on the sundial. He was still alive, having survived a gunshot wound that put him into a coma. If Maggie was the shooter, this sequence of events requires a specific chain of coincidences. Maggie, an infant in a stroller or being carried, was in the parking lot after the meeting at the same time as Burns. Burns approached her, or she was near enough to him that an interaction occurred. In the course of the interaction, his gun fell from its holster, she picked it up, and the gun discharged in a direction that hit Burns. Then Maggie remained at or near the scene long enough for Burns to observe her and form the memory that he later used to identify her as the shooter. Each of these steps is individually possible. Together they produce a sequence that requires an infant to be in an unusual location at an unusual time, to have the physical capacity to both pick up a handgun and to have it discharge, and to be close enough to Burns for him to form a clear identification that he retained through the subsequent coma. The Marge theory resolves several of these practical complications. Marge is an adult who would have the physical capacity to fire a handgun. She would have a reason to be near Burns after the meeting, as a concerned mother and wife with specific grievances against him. Burns's recognition of her, his calm and familiar "oh, it's you," matches more naturally with his established history of interaction with the Simpson family. And Burns's subsequent identification of Maggie rather than Marge, if Marge was the actual shooter, would require an explanation for why Burns chose to protect her, which the episode's depiction of Burns's complicated feelings toward Marge provides. Burns was shot. He survived. He named the one person whose identification would guarantee that no prosecution would follow, because no jury in the world would convict a baby. Whether that choice was conscious or unconscious, whether Burns was protecting Marge deliberately or whether his coma affected his specific memory of who he saw, the outcome is the same. The real shooter, if Marge was the real shooter, was never identified, and the person named was never prosecuted, and the case was closed. The perfect crime in Springfield is not one where the perpetrator is smart enough to avoid detection. It is one where the perpetrator is smart enough to ensure that the person blamed cannot be punished. Marge understood Springfield. She understood what the law would and would not do. She may have understood, consciously or by instinct, that the way to escape consequence was not to not be caught. It was to ensure that the one who was caught could not be convicted. A baby in arm's reach of a falling gun is the perfect alibi for a woman who could not afford to be found. Burns's value to the institutions that sustain him extends beyond his personal wealth. He is, in many respects, the single living repository of institutional knowledge about how certain things were done in an earlier period of American capitalism. He remembers arrangements that were made before they were illegal. He remembers deals struck between parties who have since died, deals that exist in no written record because they were made at a time when the parties involved did not need to write them down, because the enforcement of agreements depended on personal relationships rather than legal instruments. Burns's longevity means he has personal knowledge of the foundations of arrangements that continue to generate wealth and power for people who are now several generations removed from the original deal. The structures of American industrial and financial power are layered on top of earlier structures that are in turn layered on top of earlier ones still. Burns has been present for enough layers of this accumulation that his memory of how each layer was built is itself a form of power. The people who benefit from the current arrangements may not know precisely how those arrangements came to be. They may know only that they were in place when they inherited them and that they continue to function in their current form. Burns knows the original shape of those arrangements. He knows what was agreed to and by whom and under what circumstances and what the original terms were and what compromises were made to produce the current structure. This institutional memory is itself worth protecting. Not because Burns is necessarily sharing it, he has every incentive to keep it to himself, but because his existence is a guarantee that the memory exists somewhere. If Burns dies, that memory dies with him, and some of the arrangements that depend on it, that exist because of deals made before living memory and maintained by forces that no longer need to understand their own origins, might unravel in ways that nobody currently alive has the knowledge to prevent. Springfield's economy is not unusual in this respect. Most local economies in America have corners of their institutional structure that are maintained by people who remember the original deals, who know why certain things are the way they are even though the formal documentation no longer reflects the real history. The difference in Springfield is that the person with that knowledge is also the person who created it. Burns is not just the keeper of the institutional memory, he is the institution. Everything in Springfield that functions economically is downstream of decisions Burns made. The jobs at the plant, the tax base that funds the schools and the police department and the civic infrastructure, the property values that depend on the plant's continuing operation, the supply chains that connect Springfield's businesses to the wider regional economy, chains that run through the plant's operations and through Burns's network of vendors and contractors. All of it exists because Burns decided, at some point in Springfield's history, to locate his facility there and to organize the town's economic life around it. A man who is the origin of the economic structure of the town he lives in is not easily replaced. He is not even easily imagined being replaced, because imagining his replacement requires imagining a Springfield that is built on different foundations, and nobody in Springfield has the frame of reference to do that. They have only ever known the Springfield that Burns built. The vote to maintain the lie about Skinner's identity is worth examining as a political event rather than as a comedy resolution. Consider what the vote required of the people who participated in it. They were asked to formally affirm, as a community, that a specific person would henceforth be considered the person he was pretending to be, rather than the person he was. They were asked to agree, collectively and on the record, that the truth about a public figure's identity would not be acknowledged. They were asked to make this agreement in the presence of the actual person whose identity was being denied, who was right there in the room, who had presented evidence of who he actually was. The real Seymour Skinner was present for the vote. He watched the community he returned to decide, with him standing there, that he did not exist in the way he actually existed, that the person he had been before he was captured and held as a prisoner of war, the identity he had sustained through years of captivity and eventual escape, was less real than the identity someone else had been performing in his name. And then the community expelled him. They made it illegal to acknowledge the truth of his existence. They tied him to a train and sent him away because the truth he represented was incompatible with the lie they had decided to maintain. The real Seymour Skinner's experience is one of the most quietly devastating things The Simpsons has ever depicted. He survived something that should have killed him. He endured conditions that most people do not survive. He came home. And when he arrived home, he discovered that home had been reassigned. His name had been given to someone else. His mother had adopted his replacement. His community had incorporated the imposter so thoroughly that the original had no place in the community he had spent years surviving captivity to return to. He was not welcomed home. He was expelled. His survival was inconvenient. His continued existence as the actual person he had always been created a problem for the comfortable arrangement everyone else was living inside. And the community's solution to that problem was to make his existence illegal. This is not a commentary on any specific political event. It is a commentary on the specific mechanism by which communities protect comfortable arrangements from the disruption of truth. The mechanism is not complicated. It is not sophisticated. It is simply the application of collective will to the suppression of inconvenient reality. When enough people agree that a lie is more useful than the truth, the lie acquires a kind of social reality that the truth, in its isolation, cannot compete with. The real Skinner had the facts. Tamzarian had the community. And in Springfield, the community is the more powerful of the two. It always has been. It always will be. The impossibility of drawing a definitive map of Springfield is not just a geographic curiosity. It is a statement about the nature of the place and the function it serves. Real places can be mapped. They have fixed coordinates, fixed borders, fixed relationships with adjacent geography. The fixity of a real place is part of what makes it a real place, rather than an idea of a place. You can go there. You can stand in a specific location and say this is Springfield and be right or wrong. The truth of the statement can be verified. Springfield cannot be verified. You cannot travel to Springfield. It does not appear on any map because it does not correspond to any fixed set of coordinates. It is located in the imagination rather than in geography, which means it is located differently for every person who imagines it. This is, in a strange way, what the show has been constructing across 36 seasons. Not a specific place, but the idea of a place. A template for recognizing your own town as a version of something you have seen before. Springfield is the grammar of American small town and suburban life, rendered in a form specific enough to feel real, but general enough to overlap with wherever you actually are. When someone from a small town in Ohio watches The Simpsons and thinks, "This is my town," and someone from a suburb of Los Angeles watches the same episode and thinks the same thing, both of them are right. Not because Springfield contains both of those places, because Springfield is constructed from the elements that both of those places share. The same economic tensions, the same institutional frustrations, the same cast of civic characters, the corrupt politician, the incompetent police chief, the overburdened school system, the local monopoly that everyone depends on and everyone resents. The map that cannot be drawn is the map that belongs to everyone, and the place that cannot be located is the place where everyone already lives. Gentle closing passage. And so we arrive, after all these hours, at the place where every road in Springfield eventually leads. Not to a resolution, not to a definitive answer about whether Homer is dreaming or whether Burns is truly immortal, or whether Maggie pulled the trigger deliberately, or whether the radiation has been quietly reshaping everything we thought we understood about this family and this town. The Simpsons does not resolve its mysteries, it deepens them. Every answer reveals a larger question. Every explanation opens into a longer corridor of implication. What we find after all this time in Springfield is not the truth of what the show is. We find the truth of what the show does. It builds a world that is strange enough to be revealing and familiar enough to be comforting. It populates that world with people who are damaged in ways we recognize and resilient in ways we need to believe in. And it keeps that world running, season after season, year after year, long past the point where anyone would have predicted it could continue, because some part of the audience and some part of the people who make it cannot bring themselves to let the thing end. We keep coming back to Springfield because Springfield keeps being there, because the house on Evergreen Terrace is still standing, because the Quick E-Mart is still open at 3 in the morning when nothing else is, because Homer is still going to work, and Marge is still waiting at home, and Bart is still planning the next catastrophe, and Lisa is still holding the saxophone, and Maggie is still watching from behind that enormous pacifier with those enormous eyes. The mysteries do not need to be solved for Springfield to be true. The truth of Springfield is not in its answers. It is in the accumulated weight of 36 years of asking the same questions and watching the same family navigate the same impossible town and feeling every single time that something in the navigation is worth following. Something in the journey is worth the time. You can go to sleep now, if you have not already. Springfield will be here when you wake. The lights are on. The family is home. And somewhere in a town that appears on no map, in a time that passes for no one, in a dream that a man has been having since the spring of 1993, the couch is waiting. It always will be. Hans Moleman exists in a category the show has never formally acknowledged, the character whose entire narrative function is to absorb consequence. Every story needs someone to whom bad things happen for the purpose of demonstrating that bad things can happen. In most narratives, this function is distributed across the cast. Characters encounter hardship as part of their individual story arcs. The hardship means something. It changes them, or it is changed by them, or it produces some consequence that carries forward into subsequent events. Moleman is different. Moleman exists purely to receive harm, and then to have that harm mean nothing. He is crushed and shot and buried and incinerated, and he returns, unchanged, to be harmed again. He is the show's clearest demonstration of the principle that consequence does not accumulate in Springfield. That what happens to a person here does not leave a mark that the next episode will honor. That the reset is absolute and applies to everyone, not just the main family. But Molman's case is more extreme than the standard episodic reset because his harms are not narrative inconveniences resolved within the episode. They are deaths. He dies, fully and completely. And then he is alive again. This is not Homer recovering from a fall by the next scene. This is a different order of the impossible. If the radiation theory has produced in Molman the most extreme version of the biological adaptation it has produced in everyone else, the adaptation in his case may have crossed a threshold that it has not crossed in anyone else. His cells do not just repair faster than normal, they reconstitute. Whatever it is that makes a person, the biological continuity that maintains identity across time has in Molman become resistant to the interruption of death itself. He is 31 years old and appears 90. The radiation aged him in ways that should not be possible in 3 decades, and then it stopped aging him, and it gave him something back. Something that makes death, for Hans Molman specifically, a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent ending. He is Springfield's most extreme case. He is also its most ignored one. Nobody in Springfield has ever stopped to ask why the small elderly man who dies in front of them regularly keeps showing up. The collective agreement to not notice extends to him specifically. His deaths are seen, his returns are noted, and the connection between them is never drawn. He is the most visible example of Springfield's most fundamental operating principle. Some things are true, visibly and demonstrably true, and the town has decided not to discuss them. Hans Molman dies, and lives, and dies, and lives, and the town watches and moves on, because moving on is what Springfield has always done with the things it cannot afford to examine. He wanders through Evergreen Terrace and through downtown Springfield and through the backgrounds of 1,000 scenes, small and nearly blind and perpetually battered, the walking proof that nothing in this town is what it appears to be, that the rules that govern the rest of the world do not apply here, that death itself has been modified by whatever has been done to this place over the decades. He is all of Springfield's mysteries compressed into one tiny, frequently exploding person. And like all of Springfield's mysteries, he is right there in plain sight, visible to everyone, noticed by no one. Which is, when you consider it, the most Springfield thing about him. He is impossible and he is ignored. And every week he comes back to be ignored again. And every week Springfield accommodates his impossible continued existence without comment, without inquiry, without a single moment of the alarm that his situation, properly understood, would absolutely warrant. Hans Molman is fine. Springfield is fine. Everything here is completely fine. The show goes on. There is something worth saying about the act of continuing. The Simpsons has been renewed so many times that the renewal itself has become unremarkable. Another season, another batch of episodes, another year of the floating timeline extending forward, the characters aging not at all, Springfield remaining exactly as impossible and exactly as familiar as it has always been. The show goes on because it can, because there is still an audience, because the institution it has become is large enough to sustain itself on the weight of its own history as much as on the quality of any individual current episode. It goes on because it is The Simpsons, and The Simpsons going on is simply the natural state of things. The sun rises, the seasons change, The Simpsons is renewed. But the act of continuing, across this particular span of time, has produced something that no shorter-lived show could have produced. A genuine long view, a record of what American life looked like, what American anxieties felt like, what American families were worried about and laughing about and trying to make sense of, across 3.5 decades of enormous change. The show is not just entertainment. It is documentation. It is the longest continuously running record of American self-perception in the history of the medium. Future generations who want to understand what it felt like to be an American family in the late 20th and early 21st centuries could do worse than to spend time in Springfield. Not because Springfield is realistic, because Springfield is where the feelings went. The economic anxiety and the civic disappointment and the parental love and the adolescent rebellion and the marital strain and the persistent hope that something good is coming, all of it went into Springfield for 36 years. And Springfield held it. And Springfield is still holding it. Still running. Still floating. Still there. That is the final mystery of The Simpsons, and the one that no theory fully explains. Not the radiation, or the coma, or the shooting, or the immortality, or the frozen timeline. The mystery of why something keeps going after it has long since exceeded any reasonable expectation of its own duration, and what it means that it does. The answer the show itself would give, if it could speak directly about its own continuation, is the same answer it has been giving for 36 seasons through the images on the screen. Because the family is still there, because the couch is still open, because there is always one more story to tell about the people on Evergreen Terrace, and the town around them, and the plant on the hill, and the man who owns it, and the child who might be dreaming, and the baby who is watching, and the woman who is waiting, and the father who keeps finding his way home. There is always one more story. As long as there is one more story, the show continues. As long as the show continues, the family endures. As long as the family endures, the dream holds. Homer is on his way home right now. He is always on his way home. He will arrive, and the door will open, and the lights will be on, and Marge will be there, and the kids will be there, and the house will be exactly the way it always is. And for one more episode, in one more season, in the longest dream American television has ever produced, everything will be fine. Everything will be exactly, perfectly, impossibly fine. Until next week, good night.